Chapter 50 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 50. The Panacea. As if my own trouble were not enough, so deeply was I grieved by this sad news that I had a great mind to turn my back on my own and fly to far-off disasters. To do so appeared for the moment a noble thing, and almost a duty, but now, looking back, I perceived that my instinct was right when it told me to stay where I was and seek out my own sad story first. And Betsy grew hot at the mere idea of my hankering after a miller's affairs, as she very rudely expressed it. To hear about lords and ladies and their crimes and adventures was lovely, but to dwell upon a people of common birth and in trade was most unbeseeming. A man who mended his own mill, had hands like horn, well, even she was of better blood than that, she hoped. Before these large and liberal views had been fairly expounded, Major Hockin arrived, with his mind in such a state that he opened his watch every second. "Erema, I must speak to you alone," he cried. "No, not even you, Mrs. Strouss, if you please. If my ward likes to tell you, why, of course she can, but nobody shall say that I did. There are things that belong to the family alone. The most royal retainers, you know what I mean." "General, I was not aware that you belonged to the family. But this way, sir. This way, if you please. There is lath and plaster to that wall, and a crack in the panel of the door, sir. But here is a room where I keep my jams, with double brick and patent locks, from my sweet-toothed lodgers. The scutcheon goes over the keyhole, General. Perhaps you will see to that while I roll up the carpet outside, and then if any retainers come you will hear their footsteps." "Bless the woman, what a temper she has!" whispered the Major, in dread of her ears. "Is she gone, Erema? She wants discipline." "Yes, she is gone," I said, trying to be lightsome. "But you are enough to frighten any one." "So far from that, she has quite frightened me. But never mind such trifles, Erema. Since I saw you, I have discovered, I may almost say, everything." Coming upon me so suddenly, even with all allowance made for the Major's sanguine opinion of his own deeds, this had such an effect upon my flurried brain that practice alone enabled me to stand upright and gaze at him. "Perhaps you imagined when you placed the matter in my hands, Miss Castlewood," he went on, with sharp twinkles from the gables of his eyes, but soft caresses to his whiskers, "that you would be left in the hands of a man who encouraged a crop of hay under his feet. Never did you or anybody make a greater mistake. That is not my character, Miss Castlewood." "Why do you call me Miss Castlewood so? You quite make me doubt my own right to the name." Major Hockin looked at me with surprise, which gladdened even more than it shamed me. Clearly his knowledge of all, as he described it, did not comprise the disgrace which I feared. "You are almost like Mrs. Strouss to day," he answered, with some compassion. "Which way is the wind? I have often observed that when one female shows asperity, nearly all the others do the same. The weather affects them more than men, because they know nothing about it. But to come back, are you prepared to hear what I have got to tell you?" I bowed without saying another word, for he should be almost the last of mankind to give a lecture upon irritation. "Very well, you wish me to go on. Perceiving how sadly you were upset by the result of those interviews, first with Hankin and then with Goad, after leaving you here I drove at once to the office, studio, place of business, or whatever you please to call it, of the famous fellow in the portrait line, whose anagram, private mark, or whatever it is, was burned into the back of the ivory. Hankin told me that the fellow was dead, or of course his work would be worth nothing. But the name was carried on, and the register kept, at a little place somewhere in Soho, where, on the strength of his old repute, they keep up a small trade with inferior hands. I gave them a handsome order for a thing that will never be handsome, I fear, my old battered physiognomy. And then I produced the locket which in some queer state of mind you had given me, and made them hunt for their old books, and at last discovered the very entry. But to verify it, I must go to Paris, where his son is living." "Whose son? Lord Castlewood's?" "Erema, have you taken leave of your senses? What son has Lord Castlewood? The artist's son, to be sure, the son of the man who did the likeness. Is the vellum and the stuff upon it that has so upset your mind? I am glad that you showed it to me, because it would have been mean to do otherwise. But show it to no one else, my dear, except your cousin, Lord Castlewood. He has the first right of all to know it, though he will laugh at it as I do. Trumpery of that sort. Let them produce a certified copy of a register. If they could do that, need they ever have shot that raffish old lord, I beg pardon, my dear, your highly respected grandfather? No, no, don't tell me. Nicholas Hockin was never in any way famous for want of brains, my dear, and he tells you to keep your pluck up." "I never can thank you enough," I replied, "for such inspiring counsel. I have been rather miserable all this day, and I have had such a letter from America." Without my intending any offer of the kind, or having such idea as the furthest tip of any radius of mind, I found myself under a weight about the waist, like the things the young girls put on now; and this was the arm of the Major, which had been knocked about in some actions, but still useful to let other people know, both in this way and that, what he thought of them. And now it let me know that he pitied me. This kindness from so old a soldier made me partial to him. He had taken an age to understand me, because my father was out of the army almost before I was born, and therefore I had no traditions. Also, from want of drilling, I had been awkward to this officer, and sometimes mutinous, and sometimes a coward. All that, however, he forgave me when he saw me so downhearted, and while I was striving to repress all signs, the quivering of my lips perhaps suggested thoughts of kissing, whereupon he kissed my forehead with nice dry lips, and told me not to be at all afraid. "How many times have you been brave?" he inquired, to set me counting, knowing from all his own children, perhaps, that nothing stops futile tears and the waste of sobs like prompt arithmetic. "6 is 7 times you have displayed considerable valor. Are you going to fall away through some wretched imagination of your own? Now don't stop to argue. Time will not allow it. I have put Cosmopolitan Jack as well upon the track of Captain Brown. I have not told you half of what I could tell, and what I am doing. But never mind, never mind. It is better that you should not know too much, my dear. Young minds, from their want of knowledge of the world, are inclined to become uneasy. Now go to bed and sleep soundly, Erema, for we have lots to do to morrow, and you have had a most worrying day to day. To morrow, of course, you must come with me to Paris. You can parlez-vous better than I can." However, as it happened, I did nothing of the kind; for when he came back in the morning, and while he was fidgeting and hurrying me, and vowing that we should lose the tidal train, a letter from Bruntsea was put into my hand. I saw Mrs. Price's clear writing, followed by good Aunt Mary's crooked lines, and knew that the latter must have received it too late to be sent by her messenger. In a few words it told me that if I wished to see my cousin alive, the only chance was to start immediately. Shock and self reproach and wonder came, as usual, before grief, which always means to stay, and waits to get its morning ready. I loved and respected my cousin more deeply than any one living, save Uncle Sam, and now to lose them both at once seemed much too dreadful to be true. There was no time to think. I took the Major's cab and hurried off to Paddington, leaving him to catch his tidal train. Alas, when I got to Castlewood there was but a house of mourning. Faithful Stixon's eyes were dim, and he pointed upward and said, 'Hush.' I entered with great awe, and asked, 'How long?' And he said, '£24 now, and a more peacefuller end was never seen, and to lament was sinful, but he was blessed if he could help it.' I told him through my tears that this was greatly to his credit, and he must not crush fine feelings, which are an honor to our nature. And he said that I was mistress now, and must order him to my liking. I asked him to send Mrs. Price to me if she were not too busy, and he answered that he believed her to be a very good soul and handy, and if he had ever been thought to speak in a sense disparaging of her, such things should not be borne in mind, with great afflictions over us. Mrs. Price, hearing that I was come, already was on her way to me, and now glanced at the door for Mr. Stixon to depart, in a manner past misunderstanding. 'He gives himself such airs,' she said. 'Sometimes one would think but I will not trouble you now with that Miss Castlewood, or Lady Castlewood. Which do you please to be called, miss? They say that the barony goes on, when there is no more viscount.' 'I please to be called Miss Castlewood, even if I have any right to be called that. But don't let us talk of such trifles now. I wish only to hear of my cousin.' 'Well, you know, ma'am, what a sufferer he has been for years. If ever an angel had pains all over, and one leg compulsory of a walking stick, that angel was his late lordship. He would stand up and look at one, and give orders in that beautiful silvery voice of his, just as if he was lying on a bed of down, and never a twitch nor a hitch in his face, nor his words, nor any other part of him. I assure you, miss, that I have been quite amazed and overwhelmed with interest while looking at his poor legs and thinking, "Oh, I can quite enter into it. I have felt the same. But please come to what has happened lately." "The very thing I was at the point of doing. Then last Sunday, God only knows why, the pain did not come on at all. For the first time for 7 years or more, the pain forgot the timepiece. His lordship thought that the clock was wrong, but waited with his usual patience, though missing it from the length of custom, instead of being happy. But when it was come to an hour too late for the proper attack of the enemy, his lordship sent orders for Stixon's boy to take a good horse and ride to Pangbourne for a highly respectable lawyer. There was no time to fetch Mr. Spines, you see, miss, the proper solicitor who lives in London. The gentleman from Pangbourne was here by 8 o'clock, and then and there his lordship made his will, to supersede all other wills. He put it more clearly, the lawyer said, than he himself could have put it, but not of course in such legal words, but doubtless far more beautiful. Nobody in the house was forgotten, and the rule of law being, it seems, that those with best cause to remember must not witness, 2 of the tenants were sent for, and wrote down their names legitimate. And then his lordship lay back and smiled, and said, 'I shall have no more pain.' All that night and 3 days more he slept as sound as a little child. To make up for so many years, we called 2 doctors in, but they only whispered and looked dismal, and told us to have hot water ready at any hour of the day or night. Nobody loved him as I did, miss, from seeing so much of his troubles and the miraculous way of bearing them. And I sat by the hour and watched him, trusting no paid nurses. It must have been 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning. What is to day? Oh, Friday. Then Thursday morning it must have been, when the clouds opened up in the east, and the light of the sun was on the window sill, not glaring or staring, but playing about, with patterns of leaves between it. And I went to screen it from his poor white face, but he opened his eyes as if he had been half awake, half dreaming, and he tried to lift one of his thin, thin hands to tell me not to do it. So I let the curtain stay as it was, and crept back and asked very softly, "Will your lordship have some breakfast?" He did not seem to comprehend me, but only watched the window, as if a blessed face there was, looking towards heaven's glory. His lordship had it, so I could scarcely keep from sobbing, for I never had seen any living body die, but I knew that it must be so. He heard me catching my breath, perhaps, or at any rate he looked at me, and the poor angel knew that I was a woman, and being full of high respect, as he always was for females, in spite of the way they had served him, it became apparent to his mind that his pearl button of his neck was open, as ordered by the doctors, and he tried to lift his hand to do it, and then he tried to turn away, but could manage neither. Poor dear, the only movement he could make was to a better world. Then I drew the sheet across his chest, and he gave me a little smile of thanks, and perhaps he knew whose hand it was, but the look of his kind, soft eyes was flickering, not steady, I mean, miss, but glancing and stopping and going astray, as drops of rain do on the window glass. But I could not endure to examine him much. At such a holy time I felt that to watch death was unholy. Perhaps I ought to have rung the bell for others to be present, but his lordship was always shy, you know, miss, and with none of his kindred left, and no wife to say good by to him, right or wrong, I resolved alone to see him depart to his everlasting rest. And people may talk about hirelings, but I think nobody loved him as I did. Here Mrs. Price broke fairly down, and I could not help but admiring her. To a faithful servant's humility and duty she had added a woman's pure attachment to one more gifted than herself, and ruined for life by her own sex. But she fell away frightened and ashamed beneath my look, as if I had caught her in sacrilege. "Well, miss, we all must come and go," she began again, rather clumsily. "And good and great as he was, the lordship has left few to mourn for him. Only the birds and beasts and animals that he was so good to, they will miss him, if men don't. There came one of his favorite pigeons, white as snow all over, and sat on the sill of the window and cooed and arched its neck up for his fingers. And he tried to put his fingers out, but they were ice already. Whether that or something else brought home his thoughts, who knows, miss? But he seemed to mix up the pigeon with some of his own experience. "Say that I have forgiven her, if ever she did harm to me," he whispered without moving lips. "Times and times when I was young I was not always steady." And then he seemed to wander in his mind among old places, and he would have laughed at something if his voice had been sufficient. "Bitter grief and pain shall never come again," he seemed to breathe with a calm, soft smile, like a child with its rhyme about the rain when the sun breaks out. And sure enough, the sun upon the quilt above his heart was shining, as if there could be no more clouds. Then he whispered a few short words to the Lord, more in the way of thanks than prayer, and his eyes seemed to close of their own accord, or with some good spirit soothing them. And when or how his sleep passed from this world into the other, there was scarcely the flutter of a nerve to show. There he lies like an image of happiness. Will you come and see him?" I followed her to the bedroom, and am very glad I did so, for it showed me the bliss of a good man's rest, and took away my fear of death. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 51. Life Sinister. When business and the little cares of earthly life awoke again, every one told me, to my great surprise and no small terror at first, but soon to increasing acquiescence, that I was now the mistress of the fair estates of Castlewood, and the male line being extinct, might claim the barony, if so pleased me, for that, upon default of male heirs, descended by the spindle. And as to the property, with or without any will of the late Lord Castlewood, the greater part would descend to me under unbarred settlement, which he was not known to have meddled with. On the contrary, he confirmed by his last will the settlement, which they told me was quite needless, and left me all that he had to leave, except about £1,000 distributed in legacies. A private letter to me was sealed up with his will, which, of course, it would not behoove me to make public. But thus much, since our family history is, alas, so notorious, in duty to him I should declare. He begged me, if his poor lost wife, of whom he had never spoken to me, should reappear and need it, to pay her a certain yearly sum, which I thought a great deal too much for her, but resolved to obey him exactly. Neither the will nor the letter contained any reference to my grandfather, or the possibility of an adverse claim. I could not, however, be quit of deep uneasiness and anxiety, but staunchly determined that every acre should vanish in folds of "the long robe," rather than pass to a crafty villain who had robbed me of all my kindred. My hatred of that man deepened vastly as he became less abstract, while my terror decreased in proportion. I began to think that, instead of being the reckless fiend I had taken him for, he was only a low, plotting, cold blooded rogue, without even courage to save him. By this time he must have heard all about me, my pursuit of him, and my presence here. Then why not come and shoot me, just as he shot my grandfather? The idea of this was unwelcome. Still, I felt no sort of gratitude, but rather a lofty contempt toward him for not having spirit to try it. In Shoxford churchyard he had expressed, if Sexton Rigg was not then deceived, an unholy wish to have me there at the feet of my brothers and sisters. Also he had tried to get hold of me, doubtless with a view to my quietude, when I was too young to defend myself, and left at haphazard in a lawless land. What was the reason, if his mind was still the same, for ceasing to follow me now? Was I to be treated with contempt, as one who had tried her best and could do nothing, as a feeble creature whose movements were not even worth inquiry? Anger at such an idea began to supersede fear as my spirits returned. Meanwhile, Major Hockin was making no sign as to what had befallen him in Paris, or what Cosmopolitan Jack was about. But, strangely enough, he had sent me a letter from Bruntsea instead of Paris, and addressed in grand style to no less a person than "the Right Honorable Baroness Castlewood," a title which I had resolved for the present neither to claim nor acknowledge. In that letter the Major mingled a pennyweight of condolence with more congratulation than the post could carry for the largest stamp yet invented. His habit of mind was to magnify things, and he magnified my small grandeur, and seemed to think nothing else worthy of mention. Through love of the good kind cousin I had lost, even more than through common and comely respect toward the late head of family, I felt it impossible to proceed, for the present, with any inquiries, but left the next move to the other side. And the other side made it, in a manner such as I have never even dreamed of. About 3 weeks after I became, in that sad way, the mistress, escaping one day from lawyers and agents who held me in dreary interview, with long computations of this and of that, and formalities almost endless, I went for a breath of good earnest fresh air, beyond precinct of garden or shrubbery. To me these seemed in mild weather to temper and humanize the wind too strictly, and take the wild spirit out of it. And now, for the turn of the moment, no wind could be too rough to tumble in. After long months of hard trouble and worry and fear and sad shame and deep sorrow, the natural spring of clear youth into air and freedom set me upward. For the nonce there was nothing upon my selfish self to keep it downward. Troubles were bubbles, and grief a low thief, and reason almost treason. I drank the fine fountain of air unsullied, and the golden light stamped with the royalty of sun. Hilarious moments are but short, and soon cold sense comes back again. Already I began to feel ashamed of young life's selfish outburst, and the vehement spring of mere bodily health. On this account I sat down sadly in a little cove of hill, whereto the soft breeze from the river came up, with a tone of wavelets and a sprightly water gleam. And here, in fern and yellow grass and tufted bights of bottom growth, the wind made entry for the sun, and they played with one another. Resting here and thinking, with my face between my hands, I wondered what would be the end. Nothing seemed secure or certain, nothing even steady or amenable to foresight. Even guesswork or the wider cast of dreams was always wrong. Today the hills and valleys and the glorious woods of wreathen gold, bright garnet, and deep amethyst, even that blue river yet unvexed by autumn's turbulence, and bordered with green pasture of 1,000 sheep and cattle, today they were all mine, so far as mortal can hold ownership. Tomorrow, not a stick or twig or blade of grass or fallen leaf, but might call me a trespasser. To see them while they still were mine, and to regard them humbly, I rose and took my black hat off, a black hat trimmed with morning gray. Then, turning round, I met a gaze, the wildest, darkest, and most awful ever fixed on human face. "Who are you? What do you want here?" I faltered forth, while shrinking back for flight, yet dreading or unable to withdraw my gaze from his. The hollow ground barred all escape. From my own land was a pit for me, and I must face this horror out. Here, afar from house or refuge, hand of help, or eye of witness, front to front I must encounter this atrocious murderer. For moments, which were ages to me, he stood there without a word, and daring not to take my eyes from his, lest he should leap at me. I had no power, except of instinct, or could form no thought of him, for mortal fear fell over me. If he would only speak, would only move his lips or anything. "The Baroness is not brave," he said at last, as if reproachfully, "but she need have no fear now of me. Does her ladyship happen to know who I am?" "The man who murdered my grandfather." "Yes, if you put a false color on events. The man who punished a miscreant, according to the truer light. But I am not here to argue points. I intend to propose a bargain. Once for all, I will not harm you. Try to listen calmly. Your father behaved like a man to me, and I will be no worse to you. The state of the law in this country is such that I am forced to carry firearms. Will it conduce to your peace of mind if I place myself at your mercy?" I tried to answer, but my heart was beating so that no voice came, only a flutter in my trembling throat. Wrath with myself for want of courage wrestled in vain with pale, abject fear. The hand which offered me the pistol seemed to my dazed eyes crimson still with the blood of my grandfather. "You will not take it? Very well. It lies here at your service. If your father's daughter likes to shoot me, from one point of view it will be just, and but for one reason, I care not. Don't look at me with pity, if you please. For what I have done I feel no remorse, no shadow of repentance. It was the best action of my life. But time will fail unless you call upon your courage speedily. None of your family lack that, and I know that you possess it. Call your spirit up, my dear." "Oh, please not to call me that! How dare you call me that?" "That is right. I did it on purpose, and yet I am your uncle. Not by the laws of men, but by the laws of God, if there are such things. Now have you the strength to hear me?" "Yes, I am quite recovered now. I can follow every word you say, but I must sit down again." "Certainly. Sit there, and I will stand. I will not touch or come nearer to you than a story such as mine requires. You know your own side of it, now hear mine. More than 50 years ago there was a brave young nobleman, handsome, rich, accomplished, strong, not given to drink or gambling, or any fashionable vices. His faults were few, chiefly three. He had a headstrong will, loved money, and possessed no heart at all. With chances in his favor, this man might have done as most men do, who have such gifts from fortune. But he happened to meet with a maiden far beneath him in this noble world, and he set his affections, such as they were, upon that poor young damsel. This was Winifred Hoyle, the daughter of Thomas Hoyle, a farmer, in a lonely part of Hampshire, and amongst the moors of Rambledon. The nobleman lost his way while fishing, and being thirsty, went to ask for milk. What matter how it came about? He managed to win her heart before she heard of his rank and title. He persuaded her even to come and meet him in the valley, far from her father's house, where he was wont to angle, and there, on a lonely wooden bridge across a little river, he knelt down, as men used to do, and pledged his solemn truth to her. His solemn lie! His solemn lie! Such love as his could not overleap the bars of rank or the pale of wealth. Are you listening to me carefully? Or, at any rate, not both of them? If the poor farmer could only have given his Winifred 50,000 pounds, the peer would have dropped his pride, perhaps, so far as to be honest. But farmers in that land are poor, and Mr. Hoyle could give his only child his blessing only. And this he did in London, where his simple mind was all abroad, and he knew not church from chapel. And he took his daughter for the wife of a lord, and so she took herself, poor thing, when she was but his concubine. In 1809 such tricks were easily played by villains upon young girls so simple. But he gave her attestation and certificate under his own hand, and her poor father signed it and saw it secured in a costly case, and then went home as proud as need be for the father of a peer, but sworn to keep it 3 years secret, till the king should give consent. Such foul lies it was the pride of a lord to tell to a farmer. You do not exclaim. Of course you do not. The instincts of your race are in you, because you are legitimate. Those of the robbed side are in me, because I am of the robbed. I am your father's elder brother. Which is the worse, you proud young woman, the dastard or the bastard?" "You have wrongs, most bitter wrongs," I answered, meeting fierce eyes mildly. "But you should remember that I am guiltless of those wrongs, and so was my father. And I think that if you talk of birth so, you must know that gentlemen speak quietly to ladies." "What concern is that of mine? A gentleman is someone's son. I am the son of nobody. But to you I will speak quietly, for the sake of your poor father, and you must listen quietly. I am not famous for sweet temper. Well, this great lord took his toy to Paris, where he had her at his mercy. She could not speak a word of French. She did not know a single soul. In vain she prayed him to take her to his English home, or, if not that, to restore her to her father. Not to be too long about it, any more than he was, a few months were enough for him. He found fault with her manners, with her speech, her dress, her everything, all which he had right perhaps to do, but should have used it earlier. And she, although not born to the noble privilege of weariness, had been an old man's darling, and could not put up with harshness. From words they came to worse, until he struck her, told her of her shame, or rather his own infamy, and left her among strangers, helpless, penniless, and broken-hearted to endure the consequence. There and thus I saw the light beneath most noble auspices. But I need not go on with all that. As long as human rules remain, this happy tale will always be repeated with immense applause. My mother's love was turned to bitter hatred of his lordship, and, when her father died from grief, to eager thirst for revenge. And for this purpose I was born. You see that, for a bastard, I have been fairly educated, but not a farthing did his lordship ever pay for that, or even to support his casual. My grandfather Hoyle left his little all to his daughter Winifred, and upon that and my mother's toil and mine we have kept alive. Losing sight of my mother gladly, for she was full of pride, and hoped no more to trouble him, after getting her father's property, he married again, or rather he married for the first time without perjury, which enables the man to escape from it. She was of his own rank, as you know, the daughter of an earl, and not of a farmer. It would not have been safe to mock her, would it? And there was no temptation. The history of my mother and myself does not concern you. Such people are of no account till they grow dangerous to the great. We lived in cheap places and wandered about, caring for no one, and cared for by the same. Mrs. Hoyle and Thomas Hoyle we called ourselves when we wanted names, and I did not even know the story of our wrongs till the heat and fury of youth were past. Both for her own sake and mine, my mother concealed it from me. Pride and habit, perhaps, had dulled her just desire for vengeance, and, knowing what I was, she feared the thing which has befallen me. But when I was close upon 30 years old, and my mother 48, for she was betrayed in her teens, a sudden illness seized her. Believing her death to be near, she told me, as calmly as possible, everything, with all those large, quiet views of the past, which, at such a time, seem the regular thing, but make the wrong tenfold blacker. She did not die. If she had, it might have been better for both her and me, and many other people. Are you tired of my tale, or do you want to hear the rest? You cannot be asking me in earnest, I replied, while I watched his wild eyes carefully. Tell me the rest, if you are not afraid. Afraid, indeed! Then, for want of that proper tendance and comfort which a few pounds would have brought her, although she survived as a wreck, the mere relic and ruin of her poor unhappy self. I sank my pride for her sake, and even deigned to write him, in rank and wealth so far above me, and in everything else such a clot below my heel. He did the most arrogant thing a snob can do. He never answered my letter. I scraped together a little money, and made my way to England, and came to that house, which you now call yours, and bearded that noble nobleman, that father to be so proud of. He was getting on now in years, and growing perhaps a little nervous, and my first appearance scared him. He got no obeisance from me, you may be certain, but I still did not revile him. I told him my mother's state of mind, and the great care she required, and demanded that, in common justice, he, having brought her to this, should help her. But nothing would he promise, not a sixpence even, in the way of regular allowance. Anything of that sort could only be arranged by means of his solicitors. He had so expensive a son, and with a very large and growing family, that he could not be pledged to any yearly sum. But if I would take a draft for £100, and sign an acquittance in full of all claims, I might have it, upon proving my identity. Ha! What identity had I to prove? He had taken good care of that. I turned my back on him and left the house, without even asking for his curse, though as precious as a good man's blessing. 'Twas a wild and windy night, but with a bright moon rising, and going across this park, or whatever it is called, I met my brother. At the crest of a road we met face to face, with the moon across our foreheads. We had never met till now, and never heard of one another. At least he had never heard of me. He started back as if at his own ghost. But I had nothing to be startled at in this world or the other. I made his acquaintance, with deference of course, and we got on very well together. At one time it seemed good luck for him to have an illegitimate kindred, for I saved his life when he was tangled in the weeds of this river while bathing. You owe me no thanks. I thought twice about it, and if the name would have ended with him, I would never have used my basket knife. By trade I am a basket maker, like many another love child. However, he was grateful, if ever anybody was, for I ran some risk in doing it, and he always did his very best for me, and encouraged me to visit him. Not at his home, of course, that would never do, but when he was with his regiment. Short of money as he always was, though his father's nature and his own, which in some points were very the opposite, he was even desirous to give me some of that. But I never took a farthing from him. If I had it at all, I would have had it from the proper one, and from him I resolved to have it. How terrified you look! I am coming to it now. Are you sure that you can bear it? It is nothing very harrowing, but still, young ladies. I feel a little faint, I could not help saying, but that is nothing. I must hear the whole of it. Please to go on without minding me. For my own sake I will not, as well as for yours. I cannot have you fainting and bringing people here. Go to the house and take food and recover your strength, and then come again here. I promise to be here, and your father's daughter will not take advantage of my kindness." Though his eyes were very fierce, instead of being sad, and full of strange tempestuous light, they bore some likeness to my father's, and exerted power over me. Reluctant as I was, I obeyed this man, and left him there, and went slowly to the house, walking as if in a troubled dream. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 52. For Life, Death. Upon my return, I saw nothing for a time but fans and feathers of browning fern, dark shags of ling, and podded spurs of broom and furze, and wisps of grass. With great relief, of which I felt ashamed while even breathing it, I thought that the man was afraid to tell the rest of his story, and had fled. But ere my cowardice had much time for self-congratulation, a tall figure rose from the ground, and fear compelled me into courage. For throughout this long interview, more and more I felt an extremely unpleasant conviction. That stranger might not be a downright madman, nor what is even called a lunatic, but still it was clear that upon certain points, the laws of this country, for instance, and the value of rank and station, His opinions were so outrageous that his reason must be affected. And even without such proof as these, his eyes and manner were quite enough. Therefore I had need of no small caution, not only concerning my words and gestures, but as to my looks and even thoughts, for he seemed to divine these last as quickly as they flashed across me. I never had learned to conceal my thoughts, and this first lesson was an awkward one. "I hope you are better," he said, as kindly as it was possible for him to speak. "Now have no fear of me. Once more I tell you, I will not sham any admiration, affection, or anything of that kind. But as for harming you, why, your father was almost the only kind heart I ever met." "Then why did you send a most vile man to fetch me, when my father was dead in the desert?" "I never did anything of the sort. It was done in my name, but not by me. I never even heard of it until long after, and I have a score to settle with the man who did it." "But Mr. Goad told me himself that you came, and said you were the true Lord Castlewood, and ordered him at once to America. I never saw truth more plainly stamped on a new situation, the face of a rogue, than I saw it then on the face of Mr. Goad." "You are quite right. He spoke the truth, to the utmost of his knowledge. I never saw Goad, and he never saw me. I never even dreamed of pretending to the title. I was personated by a mean, low friend of Sir Montague Hockin. Base born as I am, I would never stoop to such a trick. You will find out the meaning of that by and by. I have taken the law into my own hands. It is the only way to work such laws. I have committed what is called a crime. But compared with Sir Montague Hockin, I am whiter than yonder shearling on his way to the river for his evening drink." I gazed at his face, and could well believe it. The setting sun shone upon his chin and forehead. Good, resolute, well-marked features. His nose and mouth were keen and clear, his cheeks curt and pale, though they would have been better for being a trifle cleaner. There was nothing suggestive of falsehood or fraud, and but for the wildness of his eyes and flashes of cold ferocity, it might have been called a handsome face. "Very well," he began again, with one of those jerks which had frightened me. "Your father was kind to me, very kind indeed, but he knew the old lord too well to attempt to interpose on my behalf. On the other hand, he gave no warning of my manifest resolve. Perhaps he thought it a woman's threat, and me no better than a woman, and partly for his sake, no doubt, though mainly for my mother's, I made the short work which I made, for he was horribly straitened, and in his free, light way he told me so, by his hard curmudgeon of a father. To that man, hopeless as he was, I gave fair grace, however, and plenty of openings for repentance. None of them would he embrace, and he thought scorn of my lenity. And I might have gone on with such weakness longer, if I had not heard that his coach and four was ordered for the Moonstock Inn. That he should dare thus to pollute the spot where he had so forsworn himself! I resolved that there he should pay justice, either with his life or death, and I went to your father's place to tell him to prepare for disturbances. But he was gone to see his wife, and I simply borrowed a pistol. Now you need not be at all afraid, nor shrink away from me like that. I was bound upon stricter justice than any judge sets forth on circuit, and meant to give, and did give, what no judge affords to the guilty, the chance of leading a better life. I had brought my mother to England, and she was in a poor place in London. Her mind was failing more and more, and reverting to her love time, the one short happiness of her life. If I could but see him, if I could but see him, and show him his tall and clever son, he would forgive me all my sin in thinking ever to be his wife. Oh, Thomas, I was too young to know it. If I could but see him once, just once. How all this drove me, no tongue can tell. But I never let her know it. I only said, "Mother, he shall come and see you if he ever sees anybody more." And she trusted me and was satisfied. She only said, "Take my picture, Thomas, to remind him of the happy time and his pledge to me inside of it." And she gave me what she had kept for years in a bag of chamois leather, the case of which I spoke before, which even in our hardest times she would never send to the pawn shop. The rest is simple enough. I swore by the God or the devil who made me that this black-hearted man should yield either his arrogance or his life. I followed him to the Moon Valley, and fate ordained that I should meet him where he forswore himself to my mother, on that very plank where he had breathed his deadly lives. He breathed his last. Would you like to hear all about it? For answer, I only bowed my head. His calm, methodical way of telling his tale, like a common adventure with a dog, was more shocking than any fury. Then it was this. I watched him from the Moonstock Inn to a house in the village where he dined with company, and I did not know that it was the house of his son, your father. So great a gulf is fixed between legitimate and the bastard. He had crossed the wooden bridge in going, and was sure to cross it in coming back. How he could tread those planks without contrition and horror! But never mind. I resolved to bring him to a quiet parley there, and I waited in the valley. The night was soft and dark in patches where the land or wood closed in, and the stream was brown and threw no light, though the moon was on the uplands. Time and place alike were fit for our little explanation. The path wound down the meadow toward me, and I knew he must come. My firm intention was to spare him, if he gave me a chance of it, but he never had the manners to do that. Here I waited, with the cold leaves fluttering about me, until I heard a firm, slow step coming down the narrow path. Then a figure appeared in a stripe of moonlight, and stopped, and rested on a staff. Perhaps his lordship's mind went back to some 35 years, to times when he told pretty stories here, and perhaps he laughed to himself to think how well he had got out of it. Whatever his meditations were, I let him have them out, and waited. If he had even sighed, I might have felt more kindness toward him, but he only gave something between a cough and a grunt, and I clearly heard him say, "Gout tomorrow, what the devil did I drink port wine for?" He struck the ground with his stick and came onward, thinking far more of his feet than heart. Then, as he planted one foot gingerly on the timber and stayed himself, I leaped along the bridge and met him, and without a word looked at him. The moon was topping the crest of the hills, and threw my shadow upon him, the last that ever fell upon his body to its knowledge. "Fellow, out of the way!" he cried, with a most commanding voice and air, though only too well he knew me, and my wrath against him began to rise. "You pass not here, and you never make another live step on this earth," I said, as calmly now as I speak, "unless you obey my orders." He saw his peril, but he had courage, perhaps his only virtue. "Fool, whoever you are," he shouted, that his voice might fetch him help. "None of these moonstruck ways with me. If you want to rob me, try it." "You know too well who I am," I answered, as he made to push me back. "Lord Castlewood, here you have the choice, to lick the dust or be dust. Here you forswore yourself, here you pay for perjury. On this plank you knelt to poor Winifred Hoyle, whom you ruined and cast by, and now on this plank you shall kneel to her son and swear to obey him, or else you die." In spite of all his pride, he trembled as if I had been death himself. instead of his own dear eldest son. "What do you want?" As he asked, he laid one hand on the rickety rail and shook it, and the dark old tree behind him shook. "How much will satisfy you?" "Miser! None of your money for us. It is too late for your half-crowns. We must have a little of what you have grudged, having none to spare. Your honor. My demands are simple, and only two. My mother is fool enough to yearn for one more sight of your false face. You will come with me and see her." "And if I yield to that, what next?" "The next thing is a trifle to a nobleman like you. Here I have in this blue trinket, false gems and false gold, of course, your solemn signature to a lie. At the foot of that you will have the truth to write. I am a perjured liar, and proudly sign it, Castlewood, in the presence of 2 witnesses. This cannot hurt your feelings much, and it need not be expensive." Fury flashed in his bright old eyes, but he strove to check its outbreak. The gleaning of life after 80 years was better in such lordly fields than the whole of the harvest we got. He knew that I had him all to myself to indulge my filial affection. "You have been misled. You have never heard the truth. You have only heard your mother's story. Allow me to go back and sit in a dry place. I am tired and no longer young. You are bound to hear my tale as well. I passed a dry stump just now. I will go back. There is no fear of interruption." My lord was talking against time. "From this bridge you do not budge until you have gone on your knees and sworn what I shall dictate to you. This time it shall be no perjury. Here I hold your cursed pledge." He struck at me or at the locket, no matter which, but it flew away. My right arm was crippled by this heavy stick, but I am left-handed, as a bastard should be. From my left hand he took his death, and I threw the pistol after him. Such love he had earned from his love-child. Thomas Castlewood, or Hoyle, or whatever else his name was, here broke off from his miserable words, and forgetting all about my presence, set his gloomy eyes on the ground. Lightly he might try to speak, but there was no lightness in his mind, and no spark of light in his poor dead soul. Being so young and unacquainted with the turns of life-worn mind, I was afraid to say a word except to myself, and to myself I only said, "The man is mad, poor fellow, and no wonder." The sun was setting, not upon the vast Pacific from desert heights, but over the quiet hills and through the soft valleys of tame England, and, different as the whole scene was, a certain other sad and fearful sunset lay before me. The fall of night upon my dying father and his helpless child, the hour of anguish and despair. Here at last was the cause of all laid horribly before me, and the pity deeply moving me passed into cold abhorrence. But the man was lost in his own visions. "So, in your savage wrath," I said, "you killed your own father, and in your fright left mine to bear the brunt of it." He raised his dark eyes heavily, and his thoughts were far astray from mine. He did not know what I had said, though he knew that I had spoken. The labor of calling to mind and telling his treatment of his father had worked upon him so much that he could not freely shift attention. "I came for something that can be only had from you," he said, "and only since your cousin's death, and something most important. But will you believe me? It is wholly gone from mind and memory." "I am not surprised at that," I answered, looking at his large wan face, and while I did so losing half my horror in strange sadness. "Whatever it is, I will do it for you. Only let me know by post." "I see what you mean, not to come any more. You are right about that for certain. But your father was good to me, and I loved him, though I had no right to love any one. My letter will show that I wronged him never. The weight of the world is off my mind, since I have told you everything. You can send me to the gallows if you think fit, but leave it till my mother dies. Good-bye, poor child. I have spoiled your life, but only by chance consequence, not in murder birth, as I was born." Before I could answer or call him back, even if I wished to do so, he was far away, with his long, quiet stride, and like his life, his shadow fell, chilling, somber, cast away. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 53. BRUNTSEA Defiant. Thus, at last, by no direct exertion of my own, but by turn after turn of things to which I blindly gave my little help, the mystery of my life was solved. Many things yet remained to be fetched up to focus and seen round, but the point of points was settled. Of all concerned, my father alone stood blameless and heroic. What tears of shame and pride I shed for having ever doubted him! Not doubting his innocence of the crime itself, but his motives for taking it upon him. I had been mean enough to dream that my dear father outraged justice to conceal his own base birth. That ever such thought should have entered my mind may not make me charitable to the wicked thoughts of the world at large, but, at any rate, it ought to do so. And the man in question, mine own father, who had starved himself to save me. Better I had been the most illegal child ever issued into this cold world than dare to think of my father so, and then find him the model of everything. To hide the perjury, avarice, and cowardice of his father, and to appease the bitter wrong, he had even vowed to take the dark suspicion on himself, until his wronged and half-sane brother, to whom moreover he owed his life, should have time to fly from England. No doubt he blamed himself as much as he condemned the wretched criminal, because he had left his father so long unwarned and so unguarded, and had thoughtlessly used light words about him, which fell not lightly on a stern, distempered mind. Hence, perhaps, the exclamation which had told against him so. And then when he broke jail, which also told against him terribly, to revisit his shattered home, it is likely enough that he meant after that to declare the truth, and stand his trial as a man should do. But his wife, perhaps in her poor weak state, could not endure the thought of it, knowing how often jury is injury, and seeing all the weight against him. She naturally pledged him to pursue his flight for her sake until she could be better able to endure his trial, and until he should have more than his own pure word and character to show. And probably if he had then been tried, with so many things against him, and no production of that poor brother, his tale would have seemed but flimsy invention, and guilty would have been the verdict. And they could not know that in such a case the guilty man would have come forward, as we shall see that he meant to do. When my father heard of his dear wife's death, and believed no doubt that I was buried with the rest, the gloom of a broken and faded man like polar night settled down on him. What matter to him about public opinion or anything else in the world just now? The sins of his father were on his head. Let them rest there, rather than be trumpeted by him. He had nothing to care for. Let him wander about, and so he did for several years, until I became a treasure to him. For parental is not intrinsic value, and then for my sake, as now appeared, he betook us both to a large kind land. Resolving these things sadly, and a great many more which need not be told, I thought it my duty to go as soon as possible to Bruntsea, and tell my good and faithful friends what I was loath to write about. There, moreover, I could obtain what I wanted to confirm me, the opinion of an upright, law-abiding, honorable man about the course I proposed to take. And there I might hear something more as to a thing which had troubled me much in the deepest of my own troubles, the melancholy plight of dear Uncle Sam. Wild and absurd as it may appear to people of no gratitude, my heart was set upon faring forth in search of the noble Sawyer, if only it could be reconciled with my duty here in England. That such a proceeding would avail but little seemed now, alas, too manifest. But a plea of that kind generally means that we have no mind to do a thing. Be that as it will, I made what my dear Yankees, to use the Major's impertinent phrase, call straight tracks for that ancient and obsolete town, rejuvenized now by its seigneur. The cause of my good friend's silence, not to use that affected word reticence, was quite unknown to me, and disturbed my spirit with futile guesses. Resolute, therefore, to pierce the bottom of every surviving mystery, I made claim upon Mr. Stixon, Jr., as Stixon's boy had now vindicated his right to be called, up to supper time, and he with high chivalry responded. Not yet was he wedded to Miss Polly Hopkins, the daughter of the pickled pork man. Otherwise, would he or could he have made telegraphic blush at the word Bruntsea? And would he have been quite so eager to come? Such things are trifling compared to our own, which naturally fill the universe. I was bound to be a great lady now, and patronize and regulate and drill all the doings of nature. So I durst not even ask, though desiring much to do so, how young Mr. Stixon was getting on with his delightful Polly. And his father, as soon as he found me turned into the mistress, and "his lady," as he would have me called thenceforth, whether or no on my part, not another word would he tell me of the household sentiments, politics, or romances. It would have been thought a thing beneath me to put any nice little questions now, and I was obliged to take up the tone which others used toward me. But all the while I longed for freedom, Uncle Sam, Suat Isco, and even Martin of the Mill. Law business, however, and other hindrances, kept me from starting at once for Bruntsea, impatient as I was to do so. Indeed, it was not until the morning of the last Saturday in November that I was able to get away. The weather had turned to too much rain, I remember, with 2 or 3 tempestuous nights, and the woods were almost bare of leaves, and the Thames looked brown and violent. In the fly from Newport to Bruntsea I heard great rollers thundering heavily upon the steep bar of shingle, and such a lake of water shone in the old bed of the river that I quite believed at first that the Major had carried out his grand idea, and brought the river back again. But the flyman shook his head, and looked very serious, and told me that he feared bad times were coming. What I saw was the work of the Lord in heaven, and no man could prevail against it. He had always said, through no concern of his, for he belonged to Newport, that even a British officer could not fly in the face of the Lord Almighty. He himself had a brother on the works, regular employed, and drawing good money, and proud enough about it, and the times he had told him across a pint of ale. Howsomever, our place was to hope for the best, but the top of the springs was not come yet, and a pilot out of Newport told him the water was making uncommon strong, but he did hope the wind had nigh blowed itself out. If not, they would have to look blessed sharp tomorrow. He had heard say that in time of Queen Elizabeth 60 of houses was washed clean away, and the river itself knocked right into the sea, and a thing as had been done once might just come to pass again, though folk was all so clever now, they thought they were above it. But for all that, their grandfather's goggles might fit them. But here we was in Bruntsea town, and, bless his old eyes, yes, if I pleased to look along his whip, I might see ancient pilot come, he did believe, to warn of them. Following his guidance, I descried a stout old man in a sailor's dress, weatherproof hat, and long boots, standing on a low sea wall, and holding vehement converse with some Bruntsea boatmen and fishermen who were sprawling on the stones as usual. "Driver, you know him. Take the lower road," I said, "and ask what his opinion is." "No need to ask him," the flyman answered. "Old Banks would never be here, miss, if he was of two opinions. He hath come to fetch his daughter out of harm. I doubt the wife of that there Bishop Jim, they call him, the chap with 2 nails to his thumb, you know. Would you like to hear how they all take it, miss?" With these words he turned to the right, and drove into Major Hocken's "sea parade." There we stopped to hear what was going on, and it proved to be well worth our attention. The old pilot perhaps had exhausted reason, and now was beginning to give way to wrath. The afternoon was deepening fast, with heavy gray clouds lowering, showing no definite edge, but streaked with hazy lines and spotted by some little murky blurs or blots, like tar pots carried slowly. "Hath Noah's Ark ever told a lie?" the ancient pilot shouted, pointing with one hand at these, and with clenched fist at the sea, from whence came puffs of sullen air, and turned his gray locks backward. "Mackerel sky when the sun got up, mermaidens' eggs at noon, and now afore sunset, Noah's Arks. Any of them breweth a gale of wind, and the 3 of them bodes a tempest, at the top of the springs of the year tomorrow. Are ye daft, or all gone upon the spree, my men? Your fathers would ha' knowed what the new moon meant. Is this all that cometh out of larning to read?" "Have a pinch of bacco, old man," said one, "to help you off with that stiff reel. What consarn can it be of yourn?" "Don't you be put out, mate," cried another. "Never came sea as could top that bar, and never will in our time. Go and caulk your old leaky craft, Master Banks. We have rode out a good many gales without seeking profit from Newport, a place never heerd on when this old town was made. Come and wet your old whistle at the Hocken Arms, Banks. You must want it after that long pipe." "Hocken Arms, indeed," the pilot answered, turning away in a rage from them. "What Hocken Arms will there be this time tomorrow? Hocken legs wanted, more likely, and Hocken wings. And you poor grinning ninnies, as ought to have 4 legs, ye'll be praying that ye had 'em tomorrow. However, ye've had warning, and ye can't blame me. The power of the Lord is in the air and the sea. Is this the sort of stuff ye trust in?" He set one foot against our Major's wall, an action scarcely honest while it was so green, and, coming from a hale and very thick-set man, the contemptuous push sent out a fathom of it outward. Rattle, rattle went the new patent concrete, starting up the lazy pated fellows down below. "You'll try the walls of a jail," cried one. "You'll go to Noah's Ark," shouted another. The rest bade him go to a place much worse, but he buttoned his jacket in disdain and marched away, without spoiling the effect by any more weak words. "Right you are," cried my flyman. "Right you are, Master Banks. Them lubbers will sing another song tomorrow. Gee up, old hoss, then." All this, and the ominous scowl of the sky, and the menacing roar of the sea, already crowding with black rollers, disturbed me so that I could say nothing, until at the corner of the grand new hotel we met Major Hockin himself, attired in a workman's loose jacket and carrying a shovel. He was covered with mud and dried flakes of froth, and even his short white whiskers were encrusted with sparkles of brine. But his face was ruddy and smiling, and his manner as hearty as ever. "You here, Erema? Oh, beg pardon, Baroness Castlewood, if you please. My dear, again I congratulate you." "You have as little cause to do that as I fear I can find in your case. You have no news for me from America? How sad! But what a poor plight you yourself are in." "Not a bit of it. At first sight you might think so, and we certainly have had a very busy time. Send back the fly. Leave your bag at our hotel. Porter, be quick with Lady Castlewood's luggage. One piece of luck befalls me, to receive so often this beautiful hand. What a lot of young fellows now would die of envy." "I am glad that you can still talk nonsense," I said, "for I truly was frightened at this great lake, and so many of your houses even standing in the water." "It will do them good. It will settle the foundations and crystallize the mortar. They will look twice as well when they come out again, and never have rats or black beetles. We were foolish enough to be frightened at first, and there may have been a danger a fortnight ago. But since that tide we have worked day and night, and everything is now so stable that fear is simply ridiculous. On the whole, it has been a most excellent thing, quite the making, in fact, of Bruntsea." "Then Bruntsea must be made of water," I replied, gazing sadly at the gulf which parted us from the sea parade, the Lyceum, the baths, the Bastion promenade, and so on, beyond all which the streaky turmoil and misty scud of the waves were seen. "Made of beer, more likely," he retorted with a laugh. "If my fellows worked like horses, which they did, they also drank like fishes. Their mouths were so dry with the pickle, they said, but the total abstainers were the worst, being out of practice with the can. However, let us make no complaints. We ought to be truly thankful, and I shall miss the exercise. That is why you have heard so little from me. You see the position at a glance. I never have been to Paris at all, Erema. I have not rubbed up against Parlez-vous with a blast from Mr. Bellows. I was stopped by a telegram about this job. At Crior Ilium. I had some Latin once, quite enough for the House of Commons, but it all oozed out at my elbows. And two ladies, by some superstition. It is rude, though they treat us to bad French enough. Never mind. What I want to say is this, that I have done nothing, but respected your sad trouble, for you took a wild fancy to that poor bedridden, who never did you a stroke of good except about Cosmopolitan Jack, and whose removal has come at the very nick of time. For what could you have done for money, with the Yankees cutting each other's throats, and your nugget quite sure to be annexed, or, at the very best, squared up in greenbacks?" "You ought not to speak so, Major Hockin. If all of your plans were not under water, I should be quite put out with you. My cousin was not bedridden, neither was he at all incapable, as you have called him once or twice. He was an infinitely superior man to what one generally sees, and when you have heard what I have to tell, in his place you would have done just as he did. And as for money and happy release, as the people who never want it for themselves express it, such words simply sicken me. At great times they are so sordid." "What is there in this world that is not sordid, to the young in one sense and to the old in another?" Major Hockin so seldom spoke in this didactic way, and I was so unable to make it out, that having expected some tiff on his part at my juvenile arrogance. I was just in the mold for a deep impression from sudden stamp of philosophy. I had nothing to say in reply, and he went up in my opinion greatly. He knew it, and he said with touching kindness, "Erema, come and see your dear Aunt Mary. She has had an attack of rheumatic gout in her thimble finger, and her maids have worried her out of her life. And by far the most brilliant of her cocks, worth 20 pounds, they tell me, breathed his last on Sunday night, with gapes or croup or something. That is why you have not heard again from her. I have been in trenches day and night, stoning out the sea with his own stones, by a new form of concrete discovered by myself. And unless I am very much mistaken, in fact I do not hesitate to say, but such things are not in your line at all, let us go up to the house. Our job is done, and I think Master Neptune may pound away in vain. I have got a new range in the kitchen now, partly of my own invention. You can roast or bake or steam or stew or frizzle kebabs, all by turning a screw. And not only that, but you can keep things hot, piping hot, and ripening, as it were, better than when they were first done. Instead of any burned iron taste or scum on the gravy or cloddiness, they mellow by waiting, and make their own sauce. If ever I have time, I shall patent this invention. Why, you may burn brick dust in it, bath brick, hearthstone, or potsherds, at any hour of the day or night while the sea is in this condition. I may only want my dinner, so there we have it. We say grace immediately, and down we sit. Let us not take it by surprise, if it can be taken so. Up through my chief drive, instanter. I think that I scarcely have felt more hungry. The thought of that range always sets me off, and one of its countless beauties is the noble juicy fragrance." Major Hockin certainly possessed the art, so meritorious in a host, of making people hungry, and we mounted the hill with alacrity, after passing his letter box, which reminded me of the mysterious lady. He pointed to "desolate hole," as he called it, and said that he believed she was still there, though she never came out now to watch their house, and a man of dark and repelling aspect had been seen once or twice by his workmen during the time of their night relays, rapidly walking toward Desolate Hole. How any one could live in such a place, with the roar and the spray of the sea, as it had been, at the very door and through the windows, some people might understand, but not the Major. Good Mrs. Hockin received me with her usual warmth and kindness, and scolded me for having failed to write more to her, as all people seem to do when conscious of having neglected that duty themselves. Then she showed me her thimble finger, which certainly was a little swollen, and then she poured forth her gratitude for her many blessings, as she always did after any little piece of grumbling. And I told her that if at her age I were only as quarter as pleasant and sweet of temper, I should consider myself a blessing to any man. After dinner my host produced the locket, which he had kept for the purpose of showing it to the artist's son in Paris, and which he admired so intensely that I wish it were mine to bestow upon him. Then I told him that, through a thing wholly unexpected, the confession of the criminal himself, no journey to Paris was needful now. I repeated that strange and gloomy tale, to the loud accompaniment of a rising wind and roaring sea, while both my friends listened intently. "Now what could have led him to come to you?" they asked, "and what do you mean to do about it?" "He came to me, no doubt, to propose some bargain which could not be made in my cousin's lifetime. But the telling of his tale made him feel so strange that he really could not remember what it was. As to what I am to do, I must beg for your opinion. Such a case is beyond my decision." Mrs. Hockin began to reply, but stopped. looking dutifully at her lord. "There is no doubt what you are bound to do, at least in one way," the Major said. "You are a British subject, I suppose, and you must obey the laws of the country. A man has confessed to you a murder, no matter whether it was committed 20 years ago or 2 minutes, no matter whether it was savage, cold-blooded, premeditated crime, or whether there were things to palliate it. Your course is the same. You must hand him over. In fact, you ought never to have let him go." "How could I help it?" I pleaded with surprise. "It was impossible for me to hold him." "Then you should have shot him with his own pistol. He offered it to you. You should have grasped it, pointed at his heart, and told him that he was a dead man if he stirred." "Aunt Mary, would you have done that?" I asked. "Is it so easy to talk of fine things? But in the first place I had no wish to stop him, and in the next I could not if I had." "My dear," Mrs. Hockin replied, perceiving my distress at this view of the subject, "I should have done exactly what you did. If the laws of this country ordain that women are to carry them out against great strong men, who, after all, have been sadly injured, why, it proves that women ought to make the laws, which, to my mind, is simply ridiculous." End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 54. Bruntsea Defeated. Little sleep had I that night. Such conflict was in my mind about the proper thing to be done next, and such a war of the wind outside, above and between the distant uproar of the long, tumultuous sea. Of that sound much was intercepted by the dead bulk of the cliff, but the wind swung fiercely over this, and rattled through all shelter. In the morning the storm was furious, but the Major declared that his weather glass had turned, which proved that the gale was breaking. The top of the tide would be at 1 o'clock, and after church we should behold a sight he was rather proud of, the impotent wrath of the wind and tide against his patent concrete. "My dear, I scarcely like such talk," Mrs. Hockin gently interposed. "To me it seems almost defiant of the power of the Lord. Remember what happened to poor Smeaton? At least I think his name was Smeaton, or Stanley, was it? But I dare say you know best. He defied the strength of the Lord like the people at the mouth of their tent, and he was swallowed up. Mary, my dear, get your prayer book. Rasper's fly is waiting for us, and the parson has no manners. When he drops off, I present to the living, and I am not at all sure that I shall let George have it. He is fond of possessions and all that stuff. The only possession in the Church of England is that of the lord of the manor to his pew. I will be the master in my own church." "Oh, of course, dear, of course. So you ought to be. It was always so in my father's parish. But you must not speak so of our poor George. He may be high church, as they call it, but he knows what is due to his family, and he has a large one coming." We set off hastily for the church, through blasts of rain and buffets of wind, which threatened to overturn the cab, and the seaward window was white as in a snowstorm, with pellets of froth and the drift of sea scud. I tried to look out, but the blur and the dash obscured the sight of everything. And though in this lower road we were partially sheltered by the pebble ridge, the driver was several times obliged to pull his poor horse up and face the wind, for fear of our being blown over. That ancient church, with its red-tiled spire, stands well up in the good old town, at the head of a street whose principal object now certainly is to lead to it. 300 years ago that street had business of its own to think of, and was brave perhaps with fine men and maids at the time of the Spanish Armada. Its only bravery now was the good old church, and some queer gables, and a crypt, which was true to itself by being buried up to the spandrels, and one or two corners where saints used to stand until they were pelted out of them, and where fisher-like men, in the lodging season, stand selling fish caught at Billingsgate. But to Bruntsea itself the great glory of that street was rather of hope than of memory. Bailiff Hopkins had taken out 3 latticed windows, and put in one grand one of plate glass, with finishing blinds all varnished. And even on a Sunday morning Bruntsea wanted to know whatever the bailiff was at behind them. Some said that he did all his pickling on a Sunday, and by putting up spectacle glass he had challenged the oldest inhabitant to come and try his focus. Despite all the rattle and roar of the wind, we went on in church as usual. The vicar had a stout young curate from Durham, who could outshout any tempest with a good stone wall between them, and the Bruntsea folk were of thicker constitution than to care an old hat for the weather. Whatever was sent by the Lord, they took with a grumble, but no excitement. The clock in front of the galley told the time of day as 5 minutes to 12, when the vicar, a pleasant old-fashioned man, pronounced his text, which he always did thrice over to make us sure of it. And then he hitched up his old black gown, and directed his gaze at the lord of the manor, to impress the whole church with authority. Major Hockin acknowledged in the proper manner this courtesy of the minister by rubbing up his crest and looking even more wide awake than usual, whereas Aunt Mary, whose kind heart longed to see her own son in that pulpit, calmly settled back her shoulders and arranged her head and eyes so well as to seem at a distance in rapt attention while having a nice little dream of her own. But suddenly all was broken up. The sexton, whose license as warden of the church, and even whose duty it was to hear the sermon only fitfully from the tower arch while he watched the boys and sniffed the bakehouse of his own dinner. To the consternation of everybody, this faithful man ran up the nave with his hands above his head and shouted, "All Brownsea be awash, awash," sounding it so as to rhyme with lash. The Z be all over us." The clergyman in the pulpit turned and looked through a window behind him, while all the congregation rose. "It is too true," the preacher cried. "The sea is in over the bank, my friends. Every man must rush to his own home. The blessing of the Lord be on you through his fearful visitation." He had no time to say more, and we thought it very brave of him to save that, for his own home was in the lower village, and there he had wife and children sick. In half a minute the church was empty, and the street below it full of people striving and struggling against the blast, and breasting it at an incline like swimmers, but beaten back ever and anon, and hurled against one another, with tattered umbrellas, hats gone, and bonnets hanging. And among them, like gulls before the wind, blew dollops of spray and chunks of froth, and every now and then a slate or pantile. All this was so bad that scarcely anybody found power to speak, to think, or to see. The major did his very best to lead us, but by no means could manage it. And I screamed into his soundest ear to pull Aunt Mary into some dry house, for she could not face such buffeting, and to let me fare for myself as I might. So we left Mrs. Hockin in the bailiff's house, though she wanted sadly to come with us, and on we went to behold the worst. And thus, by running the bys of the wind and craftily hugging the corners, we got to the foot of the street at last, and then could go no further. For here was the very sea itself, with furious billows panting. Before us rolled and ran a fearful surf of crested whiteness, torn by the screeching squalls, and tossed in clashing tufts and pinnacles, and into these came, sweeping over the shattered chine of shingle, gigantic surges from the outer deep, towering as they crossed the bar, and combing against the skyline, and then rushing onward and driving the huddle of the ponded waves before them. The tide was yet rising, and at every blow the wreck and havoc grew worse and worse. That long sweep of brickwork, the grand promenade, bowed and bulged with wall and window knuckled in and out like wattles. The sea parade was a parade of sea, and a bathing machine wheels upward lay, like a wrecked Noah's Ark, on the top of the saline silico-calcareous baths. The Major stood by me, while all his constructions "went by the board," as they say at sea, and verily everything was at sea. I grieved for him so that it was not the spray alone that put salt drops on my cheeks, and I could not bear to turn and look at his good old weather-beaten face. But he was not the man to brood upon his woes in silence. He might have used nicer language, perhaps, but his inner sense was manful. "I don't care a damn," he shouted, so that all the women heard him. "I can only say that I am devilish glad that I never let one of those houses." There was a little band of seamen under a shelter of a garden wall, crouching or sitting or standing, or whatever may be the attitude acquired by much voyaging and experience of bad weather, which cannot be solved as to center of gravity, even by the man that does it. And these men were so taken with the Major's manifesto, clinched at once and clarified to them by strong, short language, that they gave him a loud hurrah, which flew on the wings of the wind over housetops. So queer and sound is English feeling, that now Major Hockin became in truth what hitherto he was in title only, the Lord and Master of Bruntsea. "A boat!" he called out again. "We know not who are drowning. The bank still breaks the waves. A stout boat surely could live inside it." "Yes, a boat could live well enough in this cockle, though never among them breakers, old Barnes," the fisherman answered, who used to take us out for whiting. "But Lord bless your honor, all the boats are thumped to pieces, except yonner one, and who can get at her?" Before restoring his hands to their proper dwelling place, his pockets, he jerked his thumb toward a long white boat, which we had not seen through the blinding scud. Bereft of its brethren or sisters, for all fluctuating things are feminine, that boat survived, in virtue of standing a few feet higher than the rest. But even so, and mounted on the last hump of the pebble ridge, it was rolling and reeling with the stress of wind and the wash of wild water under it. "How nobly our Lyceum stands!" the Major shouted, for anything less than a shout was dumb. "This is the time to try institutions. I am proud of my foundations." In answer to his words appeared a huge brown surge, a mountain ridge, seething backward at the crest with the spread and weight of onset. This great wave smote all other waves away, or else embodied them, and gathered its height against the poor worn pebble bank, and descended. A roar distinct above the universal roar proclaimed it. A crash of conflict shook the earth, and the shattered bank was swallowed in a world of leaping whiteness. When this wild mass dashed onward into the swelling flood before us, there was no sign of Lyceum left, but stubs of foundation, and a mangled roof rolling over and over like a hen coop. "Well, that beats everything I ever saw!" exclaimed the gallant Major. "What noble timber! What mortice work! No London scamping there, my lads. But what comes here? Why, the very thing we wanted. Barnes, look alive, my man. Run to your house and get a pair of oars and a bucket." It was the boat, the last surviving boat of all that hailed from Bruntsea. That monstrous billow had tossed it up like schoolboy's kite, and dropped it whole with an upright keel in the inland sea, though nearly half full of water. Driven on by wind and wave, it labored heavily towards us, and more than once it seemed certain to sink as it broached to and shipped seas again. But half a dozen bold fishermen rushed with a rope into the short, angry surf, to which the poled shingle bank still acted as a powerful breakwater, else all Bruntsea had collapsed. And they hauled up the boat with a hearty cheer, and ran her straight with "Yo, heave, ho!" and turned her on her side to drain, and then launched her again with a bucket and a man to bail out the rest of the water, and a pair of heavy oars brought down by Barnes, and nobody knows what other things. "Naught to steer with, rudder gone!" cried one of the men, as the furious gale drove the boat athwart the street back again. "Wants another oar," said Barnes. "What fool I were to bring only two!" "Here you are," shouted Major Hockin. "One of you can help me pull up this pole." Through a shattered gate they waded into a little garden, which had been the pride of the season at Bruntsea, and there from the ground they tore up a pole, with a board at the top nailed across it, and the following not rare legend: "Lodging to let. Inquire within. First floor front and back parlors." "Fust-rate thing to steer with. Would have never believed you had the sense." So shouted Barnes, a rough man, roughened by the stress of storm and fright. "Get into starn sheets, if so liketh. Ye know ye may be useful." "I defy you to push off without my sanction. Useful indeed! I am the captain of this boat. All the ground under it is mine. Did you think, you set of salted radicals, that I meant to let you go without me? And all among my own houses." "Look sharp, governor, if you has the pluck, then. Mind, we are more likely to be swamped than not." As the boat swung about, Major Hockin jumped in, and so, on the spur of the moment, did I. We staggered all about with the heave and the roll, and both of us would have fallen on the planks, or out over, if we had not tumbled with opposite impetus into the arms of each other. Then a great wave burst and soaked us both, and we fell into sitting on a slippery seat. Meanwhile, two men were tugging at each oar, and Barnes himself steering with the signboard, and the head of the boat was kept against the wind and the billows from our breakwater. Some of these seemed resolved, though shorn of depth and height in crossing, to rush all over us and drown us in the washerwoman's drying ground. By skill and presence of mind, our captain Barnes foiled all their violence, till we got a little shelter from the ruins of the Young Men's Christian Institute. "Hold all!" cried Barnes. "Only keep her head up, while I look about what there is to do." The sight was a thing to remember, and being on the better side now of the scud, because it was flying away from us, we could make out a great deal more of the trouble which had befallen Bruntsea. The stormy fjord, which had usurped the ancient track of the river, was about a furlong in width, and troughed with white waves vaulting over, and the sea rushed through at the bottom as well, through scores of yards of pebbles, as it did in quiet weather even, when the tide was brimming. We in the tossing boat, with her head to the inrush of the outer sea, were just like people sitting upon the floats or rafts of a furious weir. And if any such surge had topped the ridge, such as the one which flung our boat to us, there could be no doubt that we must go down as badly as the Major's houses. However, we hoped for the best, and gazed at the desolation inland. Not only the Major's great plan, but all the lower line of old Bruntsea was knocked to pieces, and lost to knowledge in freaks of wind-lashed waters. Men and women were running about with favorite bits of furniture, or feather beds, or babies' cradles, or whatever they had caught hold of. The butt ends of the 3 old streets that led down toward the sea ground were dipped, as if playing seesaw in the surf, and the storm made gangways of them and lighthouses of the lampposts. The old public house at the corner was down, and the waves leaping in at the post office door and wrecking the globes of the chemist. Drift and dash and roar and rush, and the devil let loose in the thick of it. My eyes are worn out with it. Take the glass, Erema, and tell us who is next to be washed away. A new set of clothes props for Mrs. Mangles I paid for the very day I came back from town." With these words, the lord of the submarine manor, whose strength of spirit amazed me, offered his pet binocular, which he never went without upon his own domain, and Fisherman Barnes, as we rose and fell, once more saved us from being swamped by his clever way of paddling through a scallop in the stern, with the board about the first floor front to let. The seamen, just keeping way on the boat, sheltered their eyes with their left hands and fixed them on the tumultuous scene. I also gazed through the double glass, which was a very clear one, but none of us saw any human being at present in any peril. "Old Pilot was right, after all," said one. "But what a good job as it come middle o' day, and best of all of a Sunday." "I have heerd say," replied another, "that the like thing come to pass nigh upon 300 years agone. How did you get your things out, Jim Bishop?" Jim, the only one of them whose house was in the havoc, regarded with a sailor's calmness the entry of the sea through his bedroom window, and was going to favor us with a narrative, when one of his mates exclaimed, "What do I see yonner, lads? Away beyond the town altogether. Seemeth to me like a feller swimming. Miss, will you lend me spyglass? Never seed a double-barreled one before. Can use him with one eye shut, I suppose?" "No good that way, Joe," cried Barnes, with the wink of superior knowledge, for he had often used this binocular. "Shut one eye for one barrel, stands to reason. Then you shut both for 2, my son." "Stow that," said the quick-eyed sailor, as he brought the glass to bear in a moment. "It is a man in the waters, lad, and swimming to save the witch, I do believe." "Bless me!" cried the Major. "How stupid of us! I never once thought of that poor woman. She must be washed out long ago. Pull for your lives, my friends. A guinea apiece if you save her." "And another one for me!" I cried, whereupon the boat swept round, and the tough ash bent, and we rushed into no small danger. For nearly half a mile we had to pass of raging and boisterous water, almost as wild as the open sea itself at the breaches of the pebble ridge, and the risk of a heavy sea boarding us was fearfully multiplied by having thus to cross the storm instead of breasting it. Useless and helpless, and only in the way, and battered about by wind and sea, so that my Sunday dress was become a drag, what folly, what fatuity, what frenzy, I might call it, could ever have led me to jump into that boat? "I don't know. I only know that I always do it," said my sensible self to its mad sister, as they both shut their eyes at a great white wave. "If I possibly survive, I will try to know better. But ever from my childhood am I getting into scrapes." The boat labored on, with a good many grunts, but not a word from any one. More than once we were obliged to fetch up as a great billow topped the poor shingle bank, and we took so much water on board that men said afterwards that I saved them. I only remember sitting down and working at the bucket with both hands till much of the skin was gone, and my arms and many other places ached. But what was that compared with drowning? At length we were opposite Desolate Hole, which was a hole no longer, but filled and flooded with the churning whirl and reckless dominance of water. Tufts and tussocks of shattered brush and rolling wreck played round it, and the old gray stone of mullioned windows split the wash like mooring posts. We passed and gazed, but the only sound was the whistling of the tempest, and the only living sight a seagull, weary of his wings and drowning. "No living creature can be there," the Major broke our long silence. "Land, my friends, if land we may. We risk our own lives for nothing." The men lay back on their oars to fetch the gallant boat to the wind again, when through a great gap in the ruins they saw a sight that startled manhood. At the back of that ruin, on the landward side, on a wall which tottered under them, there were two figures standing, one a tall man urging on, the other a woman shrinking. At a glance, or with a thought, I knew them both. One was Lord Castlewood's first love, the other his son and murderer. Our men shouted with the whole power of their hearts to tell that miserable pair to wait till succor should be brought to them, and the Major stood up and waved his hat, and in doing so tumbled back again. I cannot tell. How could I tell in the thick of it? But an idea or a flit of fancy touched me, and afterward became conviction, that while the man heard us not at all, and had no knowledge of us, his mother turned round and saw us all, and faced the storm in preference. Whatever the cause may have been, at least she suddenly changed her attitude. The man had been pointing to the roof, which threatened to fall in a mass upon them, while she had been shuddering back from the depth of eddying waves below her. But now she drew up her poor bent figure, and leaned on her son to obey him. Our boat, with strong arms laboring for life, swept round the old gable of the ruin, but we were compelled to "give it a wide berth," as Captain Barnes shouted, and then a black squall of terrific wind and hail burst forth. We bowed our heads and drew our bodies to their tightest compass, and every rib of our boat vibrated as a violin does, and the oars were beaten flat, and dashed their drip into fringes like a small-toothed comb. That great squall was either a whirlwind or the crowning blast of a hurricane. It beat the high waves hollow, as if it fell from the sky upon them, and it snapped off one of our oars at the hilt, so that two of our men rolled backward. And when we were able to look about again, the whole roof of Desolate Hole was gone, and little of the walls left standing. And how should we guide our course, or even save our lives, we knew not. We were compelled to bring up, as best we might, with the boat's head to the sea, and so to keep it by using the steering gear against the surviving oar. As for the people we were come to save, there was no chance whatsoever of approaching them. Even without the mishap of the oar, we never could have reached them. And indeed, when we first saw them again, they seemed better off than ourselves were, for they were not far from dry land, and the man, a skillful and powerful swimmer, had a short piece of plank, which he knew how to use to support his weak companion. "Brave fellow, fine fellow!" the Major cried, little knowing whom he was admiring. "See how he keeps up his presence of mind. Such a man as that is worth anything, and he cares more for her than he does for himself. He shall have the Society's medal. One more long and strong stroke, my noble friend. Oh, great God, what has befallen him?" In horror and pity we gazed. The man had been dashed against something headlong. He whirled round and round in the white water. His legs were thrown up, and we saw no more of him. The woman cast off the plank and tossed her helpless arms in search of him. A shriek, ringing far on the billowy shore, declared that she had lost him. And then, without a struggle, she clasped her hands, and the merciless water swallowed her. "It is all over!" cried Major Hockin, lifting his drenched hat solemnly. "The Lord knoweth best. He has taken them home." End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 55. A Dead Letter. With that great tornado, the wind took a leap of more points of the compass than I can tell. Barnes, the fisherman, said how many, but I might be quite wrong in repeating it. One thing, at any rate, was within my compass. It had been blowing to the top of its capacity, direct from the sea, but now it began to blow quite as hard along the shore. This rough ingratitude of wind to waves, which had followed each breath of its orders, produced extraordinary passion, and raked them into pointed windcocks. "Captain, we can't live this out," cried Barnes. "We must run her ashore at once. The tide has turned. We might be blown out to sea with one oar. Then the Lord himself could not save us." Crippled as we were, we contrived to get into a creek or backwater near the Major's gate. Here the men ran the boat up, and we all climbed out, stiff, battered, and terrified, but doing our best to be most truly thankful. "Go home, Captain, as fast as you can, and take the young lady along of you," said Mr. Barnes, as we stood and gazed at the weltering breadth of disaster. "We are born to the drip, but not you, sir. And you are not so young as you was, you know." "I am younger than I ever was," the lord of the manor answered sternly, yet glancing back to make sure of no interruption from his better half, who had never heard of his danger. "None of that nonsense to me, Barnes. You know your position, and I know mine. On board of that boat you took the lead, and that may have misled you. I am very much obliged to you, I am sure, for all your skill and courage, which have saved the lives of all of us. But on land you will just obey me." "Sartinly, Captain. What's your orders?" "Nothing at all. I give no orders. I only make suggestions. But if your experience sees a way to recover those two poor bodies, let us try it at once. At once, Barnes. Erema, run home. This is no scene for you. And tell Margaret to put on the double-bottom boiler, with the stock she made on Friday, and a peck of patent peas. There is nothing to beat pea soup, and truly one never knows what may happen." This was only too evident now, and nobody disobeyed him. Running up his drive to deliver that message, at one of the many bends I saw people from Bruntsea hurrying along a footpath through the dairy farm. While the flood continued, this was their only way to meet the boat's crew. On the steps of Smuggler's Castle, as Bruntland's house was still called by the wicked, I turned again, and the new sea line was fringed with active searchers. I knew what they were looking for, but, scared and drenched and shivering as I was, no more would I go near them. My duty was rather to go in and comfort dear Aunt Mary and myself. In that melancholy quest I could do no good, but a great deal of harm perhaps, if anything was found, by breaking forth about it. Mrs. Hockin had not the least idea of the danger we had encountered. Bailiff Hopkins had sent her home in Rasper's Fly by an inland road, and she kept a good scolding quite ready for her husband to distract his mind from disaster. That trouble had happened she could not look out of her window without knowing. But could it be right, at their time of life, to stand in the wet so, and challenge Providence, and spoil the first turkey poult of the season? But when she heard of her husband's peril in midst of all his losses, his self-command and noble impulse first of all to rescue life, she burst into tears, and hugged and kissed me, and said the same thing nearly 50 times. "Oh, just like him, just like my Nicholas. You thought him a speculative, selfish man. Now you see your mistake, Erema." When her veteran husband came home at last, thoroughly jaded, and bringing his fishermen to gulp the pea soup and to gollop the turkey, a small share of mind, but a large one of heart, is required to imagine her doings. Enough that the Major kept saying, "Pooh, pooh," and the more he said, the less he got of it. When feelings calmed down, we returned to facts. Our host and hero, who in plain truth had not wholly eclipsed me in courage, though of course I expected no praise, and got none, for people hate courage in a lady. To put it more simply, the Major himself, making a considerable fuss, as usual, for to my mind he could never be Uncle Sam, produced from the case of his little church service, to which he had stuck, like a Briton, a sealed and stamped letter, addressed to me at Castlewood in Berkshire, stamped, not with any post office tool, but merely with the red thing which pays the English post. Sodden and blurred as the writing was, I knew the clear, firm hand, the same which on the envelope at Shoxford had tempted me to meanness. The letter was from Thomas Hoyle. The Major had taken it from the pocket of his corpse. All doubt about his death was gone. When he felt his feet on the very shore, and turned to support his mother, a violent wave struck the back of his head upon Major Hockin's pillar box. Such sadness came into my heart, though sternly it should have been gladness, that I begged their pardon and went away, as if with a private message. And wicked as it may have been, to read was more than once to cry. The letter began abruptly. You know nearly all my story now. I have only to tell you what brought me to you, and what my present offer is. But to make it clear, I must enlarge a little. There was no compact of any kind between your father and myself. He forbore at first to tell what he must have known, partly perhaps to secure my escape, and partly for other reasons. If he had been brought to trial, his duty to family and himself would have led him, no doubt, to explain things, and if that had failed, I would have returned and surrendered myself. As things happened, there was no need. Through bad luck, with which I had nothing to do, though doubtless the whole has been piled on my head, your father's home was destroyed, and he seems to have lost all care for everything. Yet how much better off was he than I? Upon me the curse fell at birth, upon him after 30 years of ease and happiness. However, for that very reason, perhaps, he bore it worse than I did. He grew embittered against the world, which had in no way ill-treated him, whereas its very first principle is to scorn all such as I am. He seems to have become a misanthrope and a fatalist like myself, though it might almost make one believe the existence of such a thing as justice, to see pride pay for its wickedness thus, the injury to the outcast son recoil upon the pampered one, and the family arrogance crown itself with the ignominy of the family. In any case, there was no necessity for my interference, and being denied by fate all sense of duty to a father, I was naturally driven to double my duty to my mother, whose life was left hanging upon mine. So we two for many years wandered about, shunning islands and insular prejudice. I also shunned your father, though, so far as I know, he neither sought me nor took any trouble to clear himself. If the one child now left him had been a son, heir to the family property, and so on, he might have behaved quite otherwise, as he would have been bound to do so. But having only a female child who might never grow up, and if she did was very unlikely to succeed, he must have resolved at least to wait. And perhaps he confirmed himself with the reflection that even if people believed his tale, so long after the date and so unvouched, so far as family annals were concerned, the remedy would be as bad as the disease. Moreover, he owed his life to me, at great risk of my own, and to pay such a debt with the hangman's rope would scarcely appear quite honorable, even in the best society. It is not for me to pretend to give his motives, although from my knowledge of his character I can guess them pretty well, perhaps. We went our separate ways in the world, none of us very fortunate. One summer in the Black Forest I fell in with an outcast Englishman, almost as great a vagabond as myself. He was under the ban of the law for writing his father's name without license. He did not tell me that, or perhaps even I might have despised him, for I was never dishonest. But one great bond there was between us. We both detested laws and men. My intimacy with him is the one thing in life which I am ashamed of. He passed by a false name then, of course, but his true name was Montague Hockin. My mother was in very weak health then, and her mind for the most part clouded, and I need not say that she knew nothing of what I had done for her sake. That man pretended to take the greatest interest in her condition, and to know a doctor at Baden who would cure her. We avoided all cities, as he knew well, and lived in simple villages, subsisting partly upon my work, and partly upon the little income left by my grandfather, Thomas Hoyle. But compared with Hockin, we were well off, and he did his best to swindle us. Luckily, all my faith in mankind was confined to the feminine gender, and not much even of that survived. In a very little time I saw that people may repudiate law as well from being below as from being above it. Then he came one night, with the finest style and noblest contempt of everything. We must prepare ourselves for great news, and all our kindness to him would be repaid tenfold in a week or two. Let me go into Freiburg that time tomorrow night and listen. I asked him nothing as to what he meant, for I was beginning to weary of him, as of everybody. However, I thought it just worth while having some one who bought my wicker work to enter the outskirts of the town on the following evening, and wait to be told if any news was stirring. And the people were amazed at my not knowing that last night the wife of an English lord, for so they called him, though no lord yet, had run away with a golden-bearded man, believed also to be English. About that you know more, perhaps, than I do, but I wish you to know what that Hockin was, and to clear myself of complicity. Of Herbert Castlewood I knew nothing, and I never even saw the lady. And to say, as Sir Montague Hockin has said, that I plotted all that wickedness from spite toward all of Castlewood name is to tell as foul a lie as even he can well indulge in. It need not be said that he does not know my story from any word of mine. To such a fellow I was not likely to commit my mother's fate. But he seems to have guessed at once that there was something strange in my history, and then, after spying and low prying at my mother, to have shaped his own conclusion. Then, having entirely under his power that young fool who left a kind husband for him, he conceived a most audacious scheme. This was no less than to rob your cousin, the last Lord Castlewood, not of his wife and jewels and ready money only, but also of all the disposable portion of the Castlewood estates. For the lady's mother had taken good care, like a true Hungarian, to have all the lands settled upon her daughter, so far as the husband could deal with them. And though at the date of the marriage he could not really deal at all with them, your father still being alive, it appears that his succession, when it afterward took place, was bound, at any rate, as against himself. A divorce might have cancelled this, I cannot say, but your late cousin was the last man in the world to incur the needful exposure. Upon this they naturally counted. The new Lady Hockin, as she called herself, which as much right as Lady Castlewood, flirted about while her beauty lasted. but even then found her master in a man of deeper wickedness. But if her poor husband desired revenge, which he does not seem to have done perhaps, he could not have had it better. She was seized with a loathsome disease, which devoured her beauty like Herod and his glory. I believe that she still lives, but no one can go near her, least of all the fastidious Montague. At this part of the letter I drew a deep breath and exclaimed, "Thank God!" I know not how many times, and perhaps it was a crime of me to do it even once. Finding his nice prospective game destroyed by this little accident, for he meant to have married the lady after her husband's death, and set you at defiance. But even he could not do that now, little as he cares for opinion. What did he do but shift hands altogether? He made up his mind to confer the honor of his hand on you, having seen you somewhere in London, and his tactics became the very opposite of what they had been hitherto. Your father's innocence now must be maintained instead of his guiltiness. With this in view, he was fool enough to set the detective police after me who could snap all their noses off, for he saw how your heart was all set on one thing, and expected to have you his serf forever, by the simple expedient of hanging me. The detectives failed, as they always do. He also failed in his overtures to you. You did your utmost against me also, for which I bear you no ill will, but rather admire your courage. You acted in a straightforward way, and employed no dirty agency. Of your simple devices I had no fear. However, I thought it as well to keep an eye on that Hockin, and a worthy old fool, some relation of his, who had brought you back from America. To this end I kept my headquarters near him, and established my mother comfortably. She was ordered sea air, and has had enough. Tomorrow I shall remove her. By the time you receive this letter we both shall be far away, and come back no more. But first I shall punish that Hockin. Without personal violence this will be done. Now what I propose to you is simple, moderate, and most strictly just. My mother's little residue of life must pass in ease and comfort. She has wronged no one, but ever been wronged. Allow her £300 a year, to be paid as I shall direct you. For myself I will not take a farthing. You will also restore, as I shall direct, the trinket upon which she sets great value, and for which I sought vainly when we came back to England. I happen to know that you have it now. In return for these just acts, you have the right to set forth the whole truth publicly, to proclaim your father's innocence and, as people will say, his chivalry, and, which will perhaps rejoice you also, to hear no more of Thomas Hoyle. P.S. Of course I am trusting your honor in this, but your father's daughter can be no sneak, as indeed I have already proved. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 56. With His Own Sword. "What a most wonderful letter!" cried the Major, when, after several careful perusals, I thought it my duty to show him. "He calls me a 'worthy old fool,' does he? Well, I call him something a great deal worse. An unworthy skulk, a lunatic, a subverter of rank, and a radical. And because he was a bastard, is the whole world base? And to come and live like that in a house of mine, and to pay me no rent, and never even let me see him? Your grandfather was quite right, my dear, in giving him the cold shoulder. Of course you won't pay him a farthing." You forget he is dead," I answered, "and his poor mother with him. At least he behaved well to his mother. You called him a hero, when you knew not who he was. Poor fellow, he is dead, and in spite of all, I can not help being very sorry for him." "Yes, I dare say. Women always are. But you must show a little common sense, Erema. Your grandfather seems to have had too much, and your father far too little. We must keep this matter quiet. Neither the man nor the woman must we know, or a nice stir we shall have in all the county papers. There must be an inquest, of course, upon them both, but none of the fellows read this direction, for the admirable reason that they cannot read. Our coming forward could do no good. And just now Bruntsea has other things to think of, and, first and foremost, my ruin, as they say." "Please not to talk of that," I exclaimed. "I can raise any quantity of money now, and you shall have it without paying interest. You wanted the course of the river restored, and now you have more. You've got the very sea. You could float the Bridal Veil itself, I do believe, at Bruntsea." "You have suggested a fine idea," the Major exclaimed with emphasis. "You certainly should have been an engineer. It is 1,000 times easier, as everybody knows, to keep water in than to keep it out. Having burst my barricade, the sea shall stop inside and pay for it. Far less capital will be required. By Jove, what a fool I must have been not to see the hand of Providence in all this. Mary, can you spare me a minute, my dear? The noblest idea has occurred to me. Well, never mind, if you are busy. Perhaps I had better not state it crudely, though it is not true that it happens every hour. I shall turn it over in my mind throughout the evening service. I mean to be there, just to let them see. They think that I am crushed, of course. They will see their mistake, and, Erema, you may come. The gale is over, and the evening bright. You sit by the fire, Mary, my dear. I shall not let you out again. Keep the silver kettle boiling. In church I always think more clearly than where people talk so much. But when I come home I require something. I see, instead of an idle, fashionable lounging place for nincompoops from London, instead of flirtation and novel-reading, vulgarity, show, and indecent attire, and positively immoral bathing, we shall now have industry, commerce, wealth, triumph of mechanism, lofty enterprise, and international goodwill. A harbor has been the great want of this coast. See what a thing it is at Newport. We will now have a harbor and floating docks, without any muddy, malarious river, all blue water from the sea, and our fine cliff range shall be studded with good houses, and the whole shall be called Erema Port." Well, Erema must be getting very near her port, although it was not at Bruntsea. Enough for this excellent man and that still more excellent woman, that there they are, as busy and as happy as the day is long, which imposes some limit upon happiness, perhaps, inasmuch as to the busy every day is short. But Mrs. Hockin, though as full of fowls as ever, gets no white sultans nor any other rarity now from Sir Montague Hockin. That gentleman still is alive, so far at least as we have heard of, but no people owning any self-respect ever deal with him, to their knowledge. He gambled away all his father's estates, and the Major bought the last of him for his youngest son, a very noble Captain Hockin, according to his mother's judgment, whom I've never had the honor of seeing. Sir Montague lives in a sad plight somewhere, and his cousin still hopes that he may turn honest. But as to myself and far greater persons, still there are a few words to be said. As soon as all necessary things were done at Bruntsea and at Castlewood, and my father's memory cleared from all stain, and by simple truth ennobled, in a manner strictly legal and consistent with heavy expenses, myself having made long deposition and received congratulations as soon as it was possible, I left them all and set sail for America. The rashness of such a plan it is more easy for one to establish than two to deny. But what was there in it of peril or of enterprise compared with what I had been through already? I could not keep myself now from going, and reasoned but little about it. Meanwhile, there had been no further tidings of Colonel Gundry, or Firm, or even Martin of the Mill himself. But one thing I did which showed some little foresight. As soon as my mind was made up, and long before I could ever get away, I wrote to Martin Clogfast, telling him of my intention, and begging him, if he had any idea of the armies, or the Sawyer, or even Firm, or anything whatever of interest, to write, without losing a day, to me, directing his letter to a house in New York, whose address Major Hockin gave me. So many things had to be done, and I listened so foolishly to the Major, who did his very best to stop me, that it came to be May 1862, nearly 4 years after my father's death, before I could settle all my plans and start. For everybody said that I was much too young to take such a journey all by myself, and "what everybody says must be right," whenever there is no exception to prove the rule. "Aunt Mary's" are not to be found every day, nor even Major Hawkins's. And this again helped to throw me back in getting away from England. And but for his vast engineering ideas, and another slight touch of rheumatic gout, brought upon herself by Mrs. Hockin through setting 7 hens in one evening, the Major himself might have come with me, "to observe the new military tactics," as well as to look for his cousin Sampson. In recounting this, I seem to be as long as the thing itself was in accomplishing. But at last it was done, and most kindly I was offered the very thing to suit me, permission to join the party of a well-known British officer, Colonel Cheriton, of the Engineers. This gentleman, being of highest repute as a writer upon military subjects, had leave from the Federal government to observe the course of this tremendous war, and perhaps he will publish some day, which seems as yet to be wholly wanting, a calm and impartial narrative of that unparalleled conflict. At any rate, he meant to spare no trouble in a matter so instructive, and he took his wife and 2 daughters, very nice girls, who did me a world of good, to establish them in Washington, or wherever the case might require. Lucky as this was for me, I could not leave my dear and faithful friends without deep sorrow, but we all agreed that it should be only for a very little time. We landed first at New York, and there I found 2 letters from Martin of the Mill. In the first he grumbled much, and told me that nothing was yet known about Uncle Sam. And in the second he grumbled, if possible, more, but he gave me some important news, to wit, he had received a few lines from the Sawyer, who had failed as yet to find his grandson, and sadly lamented the misery he saw, and the shocking destruction of God's good works. He said that he could not bring himself to fight, even if he were young enough, against his own dear countrymen, one of whom was his own grandson. At the same time, he felt that they must be put down for trying to have things too much their own way. About slavery, he had seen too much of niggers to take them at all for his equals, and no white man with any self-respect would desire to be their brother. The children of Ham were put down at the bottom, as their noses and lips pronounced, according to divine revelation, and for sons of Japhtha to break up the noblest nation in the world on their account was like rushing in to inherit their curse. As sure as his name was Sampson Gundry, those who had done it would get the worst, though as yet they were doing wonders. And there could be no doubt about one thing, which party it was that began it. But come what would of it, here he was, and never would sawmills see him again, unless he brought firm Gundry. But he wanted news of poor Miss Erema, and if any came to the house, they must please to send it to the care of Colonel Baker, headquarters of the Army of the Potomac. This was the very thing I wished to know, and saw now how stupid I must have been not to have thought of it long ago. For Colonel Baker was, to my knowledge, an ancient friend of Uncle Sam, and had joined the national army at the very outbreak of the war. Well known not only in California but throughout the States for gallantry and conduct, this officer had been a great accession to the Federal cause when so many wavered, and so he was appointed to a good command. But, alas, when I told Colonel Cheriton my news, I learned from him, who had carefully watched all the incidents of the struggle, that Uncle Sam's noble friend had fallen in the battle of Ball's Bluff while charging at the head of his regiment. Still, there was hope that some of the officers might know where to find Uncle Sam, who was not at all a man to be mislaid, and being allowed to accompany my English friends, I went on to Washington. We found that city in a highly nervous state, and from time to time ready to be captured. General Jackson was almost at the gates, and the President every day was calling out for men. The Army of Virginia had been beaten back to entrenchments before the capital, and General Lee was invading Maryland. Battle followed battle, thick as blows upon a threshing floor, and though we were always said to be victorious, the enemy seemed none the more to run away. In this confusion, what chance had I of discovering even the Sawyer? Colonel Cheriton, who must have found me a dreadful thorn in the flank of his strategy, missed no opportunity of inquiry, as he went from one valley to another, for the war seemed to run along the course of rivers, though it also passed through the forest and lakes and went up into the mountains. Our wonderfully clever and kind member of the British Army was delighted with the movements of General Lee, who alone showed scientific elegance in slaying his fellow countrymen. And the worst of it was that instead of going after my dear Uncle Sam, Colonel Cheriton was always rushing about with maps, plans, and telescopes to follow the tracery of Lee's campaign. To treat of such matters is far beyond me, as I am most thankful to confess. Neither will I dare to be sorry for a great man doing what became his duty. My only complaint against him is that he kept us in continual fright. However, this went by, and so did many other things, though heavily laden with grief and death. And the one thing we learned was to disbelieve 99 out of every 100. Letters for the Sawyer were dispatched by me to every likely place for him, and advertisements put into countless newspapers, but none of them seemed to go near him. Old as he was, he avoided feather beds and roamed like a true Californian. But at last I found him in a sad, sad way. It was after the Battle of Chancellorsville, and our army had been driven back across the Rappahannock. Our army, I call it, because although we belonged to neither party, fortune had brought us into contact with these, and knowing more about them, we were bound to take their side. And not only that, but to me it appeared altogether beyond controversy that a man of large mind and long experience, such as Uncle Sam had, should know much better than his grandson which cause was the one to fight for. At the same time, Firm was not at all to be condemned. And if it was true, as Martin Clogfast said, that trouble of mind at my absence had driven him into a prejudiced view, nothing could possibly be more ungracious than for me to make light of his judgment. Being 20 years old by this time, I was wiser than I used to be, and now made a practice of thinking twice before rushing into peril, as I used to do in California, and to some extent also in England. For though my adventures might not have been as strange as many I myself have heard of, especially from Suanisco, nevertheless they had comprised enough of teaching and suffering also to make me careful about having any more. and so for a long time I kept at the furthest distance possible in such a war, from the vexing of the air with cannons, till even Colonel Cheriton's daughters, perfectly soft and peaceful girls, began to despise me as a coward. Knowing what I had been through, I indulged their young opinions. Therefore they were the more startled when I set forth under a sudden impulse, or perhaps impatience, for a town very near the headquarters of the defeated General Hooker. As they were so brave, I asked them whether they would come with me, but although their father was known to be there, they turned pale at the thought of it. This pleased me and made me more resolute to go, and in 3 days' time I was at Falmouth, a town on our side of the Rappahannock. Here I saw most miserable sights that made me ashamed of all trifling fear, when hundreds and thousands of gallant men were dying in crippled agony. Who or what was I to make any fuss about my paltry self? Clumsy as I was, some kind and noble ladies taught me how to give help among the sufferers. At first I cried so at everybody's pain, while asking why ever they should have it, that I did some good by putting them up to bear it, rather than distress me so. And when I began to command myself, as custom soon enabled me, I did some little good again by showing them how I cared for them. Their poor weak eyes, perhaps never expecting to see a nice thing in the world again, used to follow me about with a faint, slow roll and a feeble spark of jealousy. That I should have had such a chance of doing good, one-fold to others and 1,000-fold to self, at this turn of life, when I was full of little me, is another of the many most clear indications of a kind hand over me. Every day there was better than a year of ordinary life in breaking the mind from its little selfish turns, and opening the heart to a larger power, and all this discipline was needed. For one afternoon, when we all were tired, with great heat upon us suddenly, and the flies beginning to be dreadful, our chief, being rather unwell and fast asleep, the surgeons away, and our beds as full as they could be, I was called down to reason with an applicant who would take no denial. A rough man, a very rough old man, and in a most terrible state of mind, said the girl who brought the message, and room he would have, or he would know the reason. The reason is not far to seek, I answered, more to myself than her, as I ran down the stairs to discomfit that old man. At the open door, with the hot wind tossing worn white curls and parching shriveled cheeks, now wearily raising his battered hat, stood my dear Uncle Sam, the sawyer. "Lor' a massy, young lady, be you altogether daft? In my best of days never was I lips for kissin', and the beautifullest creature. Come now, I ain't saved your life, have I now?" "Oh yes, 50 times over, 50,000 times. Uncle Sam, don't you know Erema?" "My eyes be dashed, and dashed they be, to forget the look of yours, my dearie. 7 days have I marched without thanking the Lord, and hot coals of fire has he poured upon me now, for his mercy endureth forever. To think of you, as like my own child as could be, only of more finer breed, here standing in front of me like this here. There, I never dreamed to do that again, and would scorn a young man at the sight of it." The sawyer was too honest to conceal that he was weeping. He simply turned his tanned and weathered face towards the doorpost, not to hide his tears, but reconcile his pride by feigning it. I felt that he must be at very low ebb, and all that I had seen of other people's sorrow had no power to assuage me. Inside the door, to keep the hot wind out and hide my eyes from the old man's face, I had some quiet little sobs, until we could both express ourselves. "It is poor Firm, the poor, poor lad. Oh, what hath happened him?" that I should see the day." Uncle Sam's deep voice broke into a moan, and he bowed his rough forehead on his arm and shook. Then I took him by the sleeve and brought him in. "Not dead? Poor Firm, your only one not dead?" As soon as words would come, I asked and trembled for the opening of his lips. "Not dead, not quite, but 10 times worse. He hath flown into the face of the Lord like Saul and his armor-bearer. He hath fallen on his own sword, and the worst of it is that the darned thing won't come out again." "Firm, the last person in the world to do it! Oh, Uncle Sam, surely they have told you." "No lies, no lie at all, my dear. And not only that, but he wanteth now to die, and won't be long first, I reckon. But no time to lose, my dear. The Lord hath sent you to make him happy in his leaving of the world. Can he raise a bed and a doctor here? If he would but groan, I could bear it a bit, instead of bleeding inward. And for sartin sure, I would groan nicely, if only by force of habit, at first sight of a real doctor." "There are half a dozen here," I said, "or at least close by. He shall have my own bed. But where is he?" "We've lain in the sand," he answered simply, "for to dry his perspiration. That weak the poor chap is, that he steameth night and day, miss. Never would you know him for our Firm now, any more than me for Sampson Gundry. Ah me, but the Lord is hard on us." Slowly and heavily he went his way to fetch poor Firm to the hospital, while, with light feet but a heavy heart, I returned to arouse our managers. Speedily and well were all things done, and in half an hour Firm lay upon my bed, with 2 of the cleverest surgeons of New York most carefully examining his wasted frame. These whispered and shook their heads, as in such a case was indispensable, and listening eagerly, I heard the senior surgeon say, "No, he could not ever bear it." The younger man seemed to think otherwise, but to give way to the longer experience. Then dear Uncle Sam, having brought a new hat at the corner of the street, came forward. Knowing too well what excitement is, and how it changes every one, I lifted my hand for him to go back, but he only put his great hot web of fingers into mine, and drew me to him softly, and covered me up with his side. "He heareth naught, naught, naught," he whispered to me, and then he spoke aloud. "Gentlemen and ladies," or "ladies and gentlemen" is the more correct form nowadays, "have I leave to say a word or two? Then if I have, as your manner to me showeth, and heartily thanking you for that same, my words shall go into an acorn cup. This lad laid out at your mercy here was a fine young fellow as the West ever hath raised, straight and nimble, and could tell no lie. Family reasons, as you will excuse of, drew him into the arms of rebellion. I may have done and overdone it myself in arguing cantrips and convictions, whereof to my knowledge good never came yet. At any rate, off he went anyhow, and the force of nature drew me after him. No matter that to you, I dare say, but it would be if you was in it. Ladies and gentlemen, here he is, and no harm can you make out of him. Although he hath fought for the wrong side to our thinking, bravely hath he fought, and made his way to a colonelship worth $5,000, if they ever pay their wages. Never did I think that he would earn so much, having never owned gifts of machinery, and concerning the handling of the dollars, perhaps will carry my opinion out. But where was I wandering of a little thing like that? It hath pleased the Lord, who doeth all things well, when finally come to look back upon, the Lord hath seen fit to be down on this young man for going again his grandfather, from California, a free state, mind you. He come away to fight for slavery. And how hath he magnified his office? By shooting the biggest man on that side, the almighty foe of the Union, the foremost captain of Midian, the general in whom they trusted. No bullets of ours could touch him, but by his own weapons he hath fallen. And soon as Ephraim Gundry heard it, he did what you see done to him." Uncle Sam, having said his say, which must have cost him dearly, withdrew from the bed where his grandson's body lay shrunken, lax, and grimy. To be sure that it was Firm, I gave one glance, for Firm had always been straight, tall, and large, and then, in a miserable mood, I stole to the Sawyer's side to stand with him. "Am I to blame? Is this my fault? For even this I am to blame," I whispered, but he did not heed me, and his hands were like hard stone. After a long, hot, heavy time, while I was laboring vainly, the Sawyer also, through exhaustion of excitement, weary and afraid to begin again with new bad news, as beaten people expect to do, the younger surgeon came up to him and said, "Will you authorize it?" "To cut un up, to show your museums what a Western lad is? Never. By the Blue River he shall have a good grave, so help me God, to my own my man." "You misunderstand me. We have more subjects now than we should want for 50 years. War knocks the whole of their value on the head. We have 50 bodies as good as this, and are simply obliged to bury them. What I mean is, shall we pull the blade out?" "Can he do anything with that there blade in him? I have heard of a man in Kentucky once." Yes, we know all those stories, Colonel. Suit the newspapers, not the journals. This fellow has what must kill him inside. He is worn to a shadow already. If there it is left, die he must. And quick stick. Inflammation is set up already. If we extract it, his chance of surviving is scarcely 1 in 100. Let him have the one, then, the 1 in the 100, like the 99 lost sheep. The Lord can multiply 100-fold, some 70, and some 100-fold. I will speak to him, gentlemen, while you try the job. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 57. Female Suffrage. All that could be done by skill and care and love was done for Firm. Our lady manager and head nurse never left him when she could be spared, and all the other ladies vied in zeal for this young soldier, so that I could scarcely get near him. His grandfather's sad and extraordinary tale was confirmed by a wounded prisoner. Poor Ephraim Gundry's rare power of sight had been fatal perhaps to the cause he fought for, or at least to its greatest captain. Returning from desperate victory, the general, wrapped in the folds of night, and perhaps in the gloom of his own stern thoughts, while it seemed quite impossible that he should be seen, encountered the fire of his own troops, and the order to fire was given by his favorite officer, Colonel Firm Gundry. When the young man learned that he had destroyed, by a lingering death, the chief idol of his heart, he called for a rifle, but all refused him, knowing too well what his purpose was. Then, under the trees, without a word or sigh, he set the hilt of his sword upon the earth, and the point to his heart, as well as he could find it. The blade passed through him, and then snapped off, but I cannot bear to speak of it. And now, few people might suppose it, but the substance of which he was made will be clear, when not only by his own knowledge of his case, but also the purest scientific reasoning established a truth more frankly acknowledged in the New World than in the Old one. It was proved that, with a good constitution, it is safer to receive 2 wounds than 1, even though they may not be at the same time taken. Firm had been shot by the captain of Mexican robbers, as long ago related. He was dreadfully pulled down at the time, and few people could have survived it. But now that stood him in the very best stead, not only as a lesson of patience, but also in the question of cartilage. But not being certain what cartilage is, I can only refer inquirers to the notebook of the hospital, which has been printed. For us, it was enough to know that, shattered as he was and must be, this brave and single-minded warrior struggled for the time successfully with that great enemy of the human race, to whom the human race so largely consign one another and themselves. But some did say, and emphatically Uncle Sam, that Colonel Firm Gundry, for a colonel he was now, not by courtesy but commission, would never have held up his head to do it, but must have gone on with his ravings for death, if somebody had not arrived in the nick of time and cried over him, a female somebody from old England. And even after that, they say that he never would have cared to be a man again, never would have calmed his conscience with the reflection, so commonplace and yet so high, that having done our best according to our lights, we must not dwell always on our darkness, if once again, and for the residue of life, there had not been some one to console him, a consolation that need not have, and is better without, pure reason, coming, as that would come, from a quarter whence it is never quite welcome. Enough for me that he never laid hand to a weapon of war again, and never shall unless our own home is invaded. For after many months, each equal to a year of teaching and of humbling, there seemed to be a good time for me to get away and attend to my duties in England. Of these I had been reminded often by letters, and once by a messenger, but all money matters seemed dust in the balance where life and death were swinging. But now Uncle Sam and his grandson, having their love knit afresh by disaster, were eager to start for the sawmill, and trust all except their own business to Providence. I had told them that, when they went westward, my time would be come for starting eastward, and being unlikely to see them again, I should hope for good news frequently. And then I got dear Uncle Sam by himself, and begged him, for the sake of Firm's happiness, to keep him as far as he could from Pennsylvania Sylvester. At the same time I thought that the very nice young lady who had jumped upon his nose from the window, Miss Annie, I forgot her name, or at any rate I told him so, would make him a good straightforward wife, so far as one could tell from having seen her. And that seemed to have been settled in their infancy. And if he would let me know when it was to be, I had seen a thing in London I should like to give them. When I asked the Sawyer to see to this, instead of being sorry, he seemed quite pleased, and nodded sagaciously, and put his hat on, as he generally did, to calculate. "Both them gals have married long ago," he said, looking at me with a fine soft gaze, "and bad handfuls their mates have got of 'em. But what made you talk of them, missy? Or, my lady, as now you are in the old country, I hear, and what made you think of them like that, my dearie?" "I can't tell what made me think of them. How can I tell why I think of everything?" "Still, it was an odd thing for your ladyship to say." "Uncle Sam, I am nobody's ladyship, least of all yours. What makes you speak so? I am your own little wandering child, whose life you saved and whose father you loved, and who loses all who love her. Even from you I am forced to go away. Oh, why is it always my fate, my fate?" "Hush," said the old man, and stopped my outburst at his whisper. "To talk of fate, my dearie, shows either one thing or the other, that we have no will of our own, or else that we know not how to guide it. I never knew a good man talk of fate. The heathens and pagans made it. The Lord in heaven is enough for me, and he always hath allowed me my own free will, though I may not have handled them cleverly. And he giveth you your own will now, my missy, to go from us or stop with us. And being as you are a very grand young woman now, owning English land and income paid in gold instead of greenbacks, the same as our nugget seems likely, to my ideas it would be wrong if we was so much as to ask you." "Is that what you are so full of, then? And what makes you so mysterious? I did think that you knew me better, and I had a right to hope so." "Concerning of yourself alone is not what we must think of. You might do this or you might do that, according to what you was told, or even more according to what was denied you. For poor honest people like Firm and me, to deal with such a case is out of knowledge. For us it is go by the will of the Lord, and dead again your own desires." "But, dear Uncle Sam," I cried, feeling that now I had him upon his own tenterhooks, "you rebuked me as sharply as lies in your nature for daring to talk about fate just now. But to what else comes your own conduct if you are bound to go against your own desire? If you have such a lot of free will, why must you do what you do not like to do?" "Well, well, perhaps I was talking rather large. The will of the world is upon us as well, and we must have respect for its settlements." "Now let me," I said, with a trembling wish to have everything right and maidenly. "I have seen so much harm from misunderstandings, and they are so simple when it is too late. Let me ask you one or two questions, Uncle Sam. You always answer everybody, and to you a crooked answer is impossible." "Business is business," the Sawyer said. "My dear, I contract accordingly." "Very well. Then, in the first place, what do you wish to have done with me? Putting aside all the gossip, I mean, of people who have never even heard of me." "Why, to take you back to Sawmill with us, where you always was so natural." "In the next place, what does your grandson wish?" "To take you back to Sawmill with him, and keep you there till death do you part, as chanceth to all mortal pairs." "And now, Uncle Sam, what do I wish? You say we all have so much free will." "It is natural that you should wish, my dear, to go and be a great lady, and marry a nobleman of your own rank, and have lots of little noblemen." "Then I fly against nature, and the fault is yours for filling me so with machinery." The Sawyer was beaten, and he never said again that a woman cannot argue. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Erema. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. Erema by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 58. Beyond Desert and Deserts. From all the carnage, havoc, ruin, hatred, and fury of that wicked war, we set our little convoy forth, with passes procured from either side. According to all rules of war, Firm was no doubt a prisoner, but having saved his life, and taken his word to serve no more against them, remembering also that he had done them more service than 10 regiments, the Federal authorities were not sorry to be quit of him. He, for his part, being of a deep, retentive nature, bore in his wounded breast a sorrow which would last his lifetime. To me he said not a single word about his bitter fortune, and he could not bring himself to ask me whether I would share it. Only from his eyes sometimes I knew what he was thinking, and having passed through so much grief, I was moved with deep compassion. Poor Firm had been trained by his grandfather to a strong, earnest faith in Providence, and now this compelled him almost to believe that he had been specially visited. For flying in the face of his good grandfather, and selfishly indulging his own stiff neck, his punishment had been hard, and almost heavier than he could bear. Whatever might happen to him now, the spring and flower of his life were gone. He still might have some calm existence, but never win another day of cloudless joy. And if he had only said this, or thought about it, we might have looked at him with less sadness of our own. But he never said anything about himself, nor gave any opening for our comfort to come to him. Only from day to day he behaved gently and lovingly to both of us, as if his own trouble must be fought out by himself, and should dim no other happiness. And this kept us thinking of his sorrow all the more, so that I could not even look at him without a flutter of the heart, which was afraid to be a sigh. At last, upon the great mountain range through which we now were toiling, with the snow little more than a mantle for the peaks, and a sparkling veil for sunrise, dear Uncle Sam, who had often shown signs of impatience, drew me apart from the rest. Straightforward and blunt as he generally was, he did not seem altogether ready to begin, but pulled off his hat, and then put it on again, the weather being now cold and hot by turns. And while he did this he was thinking at his utmost, as every full vein of his forehead declared. And being at home with his ways, I waited. "Think you got ahead of me? No, not you," he exclaimed at last, in reply to some version of his own of my ideas, which I carefully made a nonentity under the scrutiny of his keen blue eyes. "No, no, missy, you wait a bit. Uncle Sam was not hatched yesterday, and it takes 50 young ladies to go round him." "Is that from your size, Uncle Sam, or your depth?" "Well, a mixture of both, I do believe. Now the last thing you ever would think of, if you lived to be older than Washington's nurse, is the very thing I mean to put to you. Only you please must take it well according to my meaning. You see our Firm going to a shadow, don't you? Very well, the fault of that is all yourn. Why not up and speak to him?" "I speak to him every day, Uncle Sam, and I spare no efforts to fatten him. I am sure I never dreamed of becoming such a cook. But soon he will have suan isco." "Oh, Injun be darned! It's not the stomach, it's the heart as wants nourishment with you, poor lad. He looketh that pitiful at you sometimes, my faith, I can hardly tell whether to laugh at his mewings or cry at the lean face that does it." "You are not talking like yourself, Uncle Sam, and he never does anything of the kind. I am sure there is nothing to laugh at." "No, no, to be sure not. I made a mistake. Heroic is the word, of course. Everything is heroic." It is heroic," I answered, with some vexation at his lightness. "If you cannot see it, I am sorry for you. I like large things, and I know of nothing larger than the way poor Firm is going on." "You to stand up for him," Colonel Gundry answered, as if he could scarcely look at me. "You to talk large of him, my Lady Castlewood, while you are doing of his heart into small wittles. Well, I did believe, if no one else, that you were a straightforward one." "And what am I a doing that is crooked now?" "Well, not to say crooked, Miss Rema, no, no, only onconsistent when squared up." Uncle Sam, you're a puzzle to me to-day. What is inconsistent? What is there to square up?" He fetched a long breath, and looked wondrous wise. Then, as if his main object was to irritate me, he made a long stride, and said, "Soup's a b'ilin now." "Let it boil over, then. You must say what you mean. Oh, Uncle Sam, I only want to do the right." "I dessay. But have you got the pluck, miss? Our little missy would have done more than that. But come to be a great lady, why, they take another tune. With much mind, of course, it might be otherwise. But none of 'em have much of that to spare." "Your view is a narrow one," I replied, knowing how that would astonish him. "You judge by your own experience only, and to do that shows a sad want of breadth, as ladies in England express it." The Sawyer stared, and then took off his hat, and then felt all about for his spectacles. The idea of being regarded by a female from a larger and loftier point of view made a new sensation in his system. "Yes," I continued, with some enjoyment, "let us try to look largely at all things, Uncle Sam, and supposing me capable of that, what is the proper and the lofty course to take?" He looked at me with a strange twinkle in his eyes, and with 3 words discomfited me. "Pop the question." Much as I had heard of women's rights, equality of body and mind with man, and superiority in morals, it did not appear to me that her privilege could be driven to this extent. But I shook my head till all my hair came down. And so, if our constitutional right of voting by color was exercised, on this occasion it claimed the timid benefit of ballot. With us, a suggestion, for the time discarded, has often double effect by and by; and though it was out of my power to dream of acting up to such directions, there could be no possible harm in reviewing such a theory theoretically. Now, nothing beyond this was in my thoughts, nor even so much as that, safely may I say, when Firm and myself met face to face on the 3rd day after Uncle Sam's ideas. Our little caravan, of which the Sawyer was the captain, being bound for Blue River and its neighborhood, had quitted the Sacramento track by a fork on the left, not a league from the spot where my father had bidden adieu to mankind. And knowing every twist and turn of rock, our drivers brought us at the camping time almost to the verge of chaparral. I knew not exactly how far we were come, but the dust cloud of memory was stirring, and though the mountains looked smaller than they used to look, the things done among them seemed larger. And wandering forth from the camp to think, when the evening meal was over, lo, there I stood in that self-same breach, or portal of the desert, in which I stood once by my father's side, with scared and weary eyes vainly seeking safety's shattered landmark. The time of year was different, being the ripe end of October now, but though the view was changed in tint, it was even more impressive. Somber memories, and deep sense of grandeur, which is always sad, and solemn lights and stealing shadows compassed me with thoughtfulness. In the mouth of the gorge was a gray block of granite, whereupon I sat down to think. Old thoughts, dull thoughts, thoughts as common as the clouds that cross the distant plain, and as vague as the wind that moves them. They please and they pass, and they may have shed kindly influence, but what are they? The life that lies before us is, in some way too, below us, like yon vast amplitude of plain, but it must be traversed foot by foot, and laboriously travailed, without the cloudy vaporing or the high-flown meditation. And all that must be done by me, alone, with none to love me, and, which for a woman is so much worse, nobody ever to have for my own to cherish, love, and cling to. Tier upon tier, and peak over peak, The finest mountains of the world are soaring into the purple firmament. Like northern lights, they flash or flush or fade into a reclining gleam. Like ladders of heaven, they bar themselves with cloudy air, and like heaven itself, they rank their white procession. Lonely, feeble, puny, I look up with awe and reverence. The mind pronounces all things small compared with this magnificence. Yet, what will all such grandeur do? The self-defensive heart inquires, for puny, feeble, lonely me. Before another shadow deepened, or another light grew pale, a slow, uncertain step drew near, and by the merest chance it happened to be Ephraim Gundry's. I was quite surprised and told him so, and he said that he also was surprised at meeting me in this way. Remembering how long I had been there, I thought it most irrational, but checked myself from saying so, because he looked so poorly. And more than that, I asked him kindly how he was this evening, and smoothed my dress to please his eye, and offered him a chair of rock. But he took no notice of all these things. I thought of the time when he would have behaved so very differently from this, and nothing but downright pride enabled me to repress vexation. However, I resolved to behave as kindly as if he were my own grandfather. "How grand these mountains are!" I said. "It must do you good to see them again. Even to me it is such a delight. And what must it be to you, a native?" "Yes, I shall wander from them no more. How I wish that I had never done so!" "Have men less courage than women?" I asked, with one glance at his pale, worn face. "I owe you the debt of life, and this is the place to think and speak of it. I used to talk freely of that, you know. You used to like to hear me speak, but now you are tired of that, and tired of all the world as well, I fear." "No, I am tired of nothing except my own vile degradation. I am tired of my want of spirit, that I cannot cast my load. I am tired of my lack of reason, which should always guide a man. What is the use of mind or intellect, reasoning power, or whatever it is called, if the whole of them cannot enable a man to hold out against a stupid heart?" "I think you should be proud," I said, while trembling to approach the subject, which never had been touched between us, "at having a nature so sensitive. Your evil chance might have been anybody's, and must of course have been somebody's, but nobody else would have taken it so delightfully as you have done." "Delightfully? Is that the word you use? May I ask who gets any delight from it?" "Why, all who hate the Southern cause," I replied, with sudden turn of thought, though I had never meant to use the word. "Surely that needs no explanation." "They are delighted, are they? Yes, I can very well believe it. Narrow-minded bigots. Yes, they are sure to be delighted. They call it a just visitation, of course, a righteous retribution, and I hope I may never get over it." "I pray you to take it more gently," I said. "They are very good men, and wish you no harm. But they must have their own opinions, and naturally they think them just." "Then all their opinions are just wrong. They hope to see me go down to my grave. They shall not have that pleasure. I will outlive every old John Brown of them. I did not care 2 cents to live just now. Henceforth I will make a point of it. If I cannot fight for true freedom any more, having ruined it perhaps already, the least I can do is give them no more triumph to its bitter enemies. I will eat and drink, and begin this very night. I suppose you are one of them, as you put their arguments so neatly. I suppose you consider me a vile slave driver?" "You are very ill," I said, with my heart so full of pity that anger could not enter. "You are still very ill, and very weak. How could you drive the very best slave now, even such a marvel as Uncle Tom?" Firm Gundry smiled. On his lean, dry face there shone a little flicker, which made me think of the time when he brought the jest book, purchased at Cincinnati, to make himself agreeable to my mind. And little as I meant it, I smiled also, thinking of the way he used to come out with his hard-fought jokes and expect it. "I wish you were all that you used to be," he said, looking at me softly through the courage of his smile, "instead of being such a grand lady." "And I wish you were a little more like yourself," I answered, without thinking. "You used to think always there was nobody like me." "Suppose that I am of that same opinion still, tenfold, fiftyfold, a millionfold?" "To suppose a thing of that sort is a little too absurd, when you have shown no sign of it." "For your own dear sake I have shown no sign. The reason of that is too clear to explain." "Then how stupid I must be not to see an atom of it." "Why, who would have anything to say to me, a broken down man, a fellow marked out for curses, one who hates even the sight of himself? The lowest of the low would shun me." He turned away from me, and gazed back toward the dismal, miserable, spectral desert, while I stood facing the fruitful, delicious, flowery paradise of all the world. I thought of the difference in our lots, and my heart was in misery about him. Then I conquered my pride and my littleness and trumpery, and did what the gentle, sweet Eve might have done. And never have I grieved for that action since. With tears on my cheeks quite undissembled, and a breast not ashamed of fluttering, I ran to Firm Gundry and took his right hand, and allowed him no refuge from tender wet eyes. Then, before he could come to see the meaning of this haste, because of his very high discipline, I was out of his distance and sitting on a rock, and I lifted my eyes, full of eloquence, to his, and then I dropped them, and pulled my hat forward, and said, as calmly as was possible, "I have done enough. The rest remains with you, Firm Gundry." The rest remained with him. Enough that I was part of that rest, if not the foundation or crown of it, something desirous to be both, and failing, if fail it ever does, from no want of trial. Uncle Sam says that I never fail at all, and never did fail in anything, unless it was when I found that blamed nugget, for which we got 3 wagon loads of greenbacks, which, when prosperity at last revives, will pay perhaps for greasing all 12 wheels. Jowler admits not that failure even. As soon as he recovered from canine dementia, approaching very close to rabies, at seeing me in the flesh once more, so that the Sierra Nevada rang with avalanches of barking, he tugged me to the place where his teeth were set in gold, and proved that he had no hydrophobia. His teeth are scanty now, but he can still catch a salmon, and the bright zeal and loyalty of his soft brown eyes and the sprightly elevation of his tail are still among dogs as preeminent as they are to mankind inimitable. Now the war is past, and here we sit by the banks of the soft blue river. The early storm and young conflict of a clouded life are over. Still, out of sight there may be yet a sea of troubles to buffet with, but it is not merely a selfish thought that others will face it with me. Dark mysteries have been cleared away by being confronted bravely, and the lesson has been learned that life, like California flowers, is of infinite variety. This little river 10 steps wide, on one side all has lupins, and on the other side all larkspurs. Can I tell why? Can anybody? Can even itself, so full of voice and light, unroll the reason? Behind us tower the stormy crags, Before us spread soft tapestry of earth and sweep of ocean. Below us lies my father's grave, whose sin was not his own, but fell upon him, and found him loyal. To him was I loyal also, as a daughter should be, and in my lap lies my reward, for I am no more Erema. End of chapter 58. Recording by Linda Dodge. End of Erema by Richard Doddridge Blackmore.